She walked into the most dangerous man's office in New York City carrying a marketing proposal. She walked out wearing his ring, not because she wanted to. Because her family was drowning, the debt collectors were already at the door, and Luca Moretti had just made her an offer that no desperate woman with a spine could simply walk away from. 1 year as his wife. One contract, enough money to save everything she'd spent her whole life protecting. She should have said no. Every single intelligent bone in her body was screaming at her to turn around, get back in that elevator, and never look back. Instead, Selena Vaughn said maybe, and that maybe changed everything. If you're new here, stay until the very end. This story will break your heart before it puts it back together. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The rain that night wasn't the kind that cleaned anything. It came down hard and sideways, driven by a wind that had been building over the Atlantic for 3 days before finally slamming into Manhattan like it had a personal grudge against the city. It turned the streets into black mirrors, sent umbrellas inside out, and plastered the hair of every person unfortunate enough to be outside against their faces. Cab drivers laid on their horns for no reason other than the fact that they could. Steam punched up through the grates in the sidewalk like the city was breathing out something hot and angry from somewhere far below. Selena Vaughn stood on the corner of 54th and Lexington and stared up at Moretti Tower. 70 floors of black glass and polished steel rising straight into a sky that had turned the color of a bruise. The building didn't look like an office. It looked like a statement. It looked like a threat made permanent in concrete and money. Every window was lit from inside, and from down here on the street with rain running into the collar of her good wool coat, the one she'd bought 3 years ago for job interviews and hadn't replaced because she hadn't been able to afford to. The whole tower looked like something that existed in a different world entirely. A world where people didn't check their bank balances twice before buying groceries. A world where rent wasn't something you lost sleep over. She had 14 minutes. She knew that because she'd been standing on this corner for 6 minutes already, which was stupid, which was exactly the kind of thing her mother would have called her out for. Selena Rose Vaughn, standing in the rain feeling sorry for yourself, is not a personality. Her mother had been dead for 4 years, and she still heard her voice at the worst possible moments. She tightened her grip on the leather portfolio case under her arm and crossed the street. The lobby of Moretti Tower hit her like a physical object. Warmth, the smell of expensive flowers, something white and sharp she couldn't name. And beneath that, the subtle pressure of serious money, the kind that didn't need to announce itself because it was already everywhere in the Italian marble floors and the art on the walls that definitely hadn't come from a catalog. 2 security guards in suits that cost more than her monthly rent stood at the front desk. Not hotel concierge types, not rent-a-cop types. These were men who had military in their posture and something harder in their eyes. And they looked at her the way people looked at something that might need to be dealt with. "Selena Vaughn," she said, before either of them could speak. 7 o'clock meeting. Vaughn Creative, presenting to the Moretti Hospitality Division. The taller of the two checked something on a tablet without acknowledging that she'd spoken. 30 seconds passed. He looked up. 70th floor, private elevator, end of the hall. Someone will meet you. She walked toward the elevator like she belonged there. She was good at that. Walking like she belonged in rooms that didn't want her. She'd had a lot of practice. The private elevator was different from the main bank. Smaller. No buttons on the inside except for a single keypad. The doors were mirrored and she caught a glimpse of herself. Wet hair she'd mostly salvaged on the walk from the cab. The black dress she'd borrowed from her colleague Dana because her own presentation wardrobe was limited, and this meeting was supposed to be the most important pitch of the year. The portfolio case she was holding with both hands now, like it was something that could save her, which it actually might. Vaughn Creative had been her father's company. Mitchell Vaughn had built it from one rented office and one client in the mid-90s into a mid-sized marketing firm with 30 employees and a solid reputation in the luxury hospitality sector. He'd spent 22 years building it. Then he'd spent 3 years quietly making the kind of financial decisions that men under pressure make when they're too proud to admit they're drowning, and by the time Selena understood the full picture, the company was one bad quarter away from going under entirely. Her father had stepped back. Or been pushed back, depending on who was telling the story. Either way, Selena had stepped in as acting director at 27, inherited the title officially at 28, and spent the last 14 months trying to rebuild what it had taken her father 2 decades to create while simultaneously managing the debt he'd left behind, and the staff that depended on her and the guilt of knowing that if she failed, 30 people lost their livelihoods. She was 29 years old and she felt about 53. The Moretti hospitality account would change everything. The Moretti family owned 11 luxury hotels across the eastern seaboard, 3 in Europe and 2 in development in Southeast Asia. A contract with even the domestic portfolio would give Vaughn Creative enough stability to last another 5 years. It would give her room to breathe, to fix what her father had broken without watching the walls close in every single month. She'd been trying to get this meeting for 7 months. The elevator stopped. The doors opened. A woman in a gray suit was waiting. Mid-40s, hair pulled back so severely it looked structural, face completely neutral in the way of people who had been trained to show nothing. "Ms. Vaughn, I'm Clara, executive assistant to Mr. Moretti. He's ready for you." Selena followed her down a corridor that was all low light and dark wood paneling, past a series of doors, and into a conference room that occupied the northeast corner of the 70th floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows on 2 sides. The rain hitting the glass, the whole city spread out below, wet and electric and enormous. There were 4 people in the room. 3 of them she recognized from her research, 2 senior executives from the Moretti hospitality arm and a legal advisor. Standard meeting configuration. The 4th man was standing at the window with his back to the room. He turned when she walked in. Selena had done her research on Luca Moretti. She'd read the business profiles, the magazine features, the carefully curated public narrative about the 34-year-old who had taken over his family's vast business holdings at 31 following his father's death and expanded them dramatically in the 3 years since. She'd seen photographs. She knew what he looked like. Photographs, it turned out, were a completely inadequate medium for the actual experience of Luca Moretti in a room. He was tall, not dramatically so, but the way he stood made the room feel smaller. Dark suit, no tie, the top button of his shirt open in a way that managed to look deliberate rather than casual. Dark hair, olive skin, jaw that looked like it had been designed specifically to be unreadable. But none of that was the thing that hit her when he turned around. The thing that hit her was his eyes, gray. Not the warm gray of storm clouds, the cold gray of the ocean in January, and they were already on her like he'd been watching her walk in from across a room in the dark, like he'd already made some preliminary assessment she hadn't consented to. He didn't say hello. "You're 7 minutes late," he said. Selena set her portfolio on the conference table and looked directly at him. "The cab was caught behind an accident on Lexington. I called ahead." She glanced at Clara, who gave nothing. "I was told it was noted." "It was noted," he said. "That doesn't make you on time." She felt the temperature in the room drop 2 degrees and understood immediately that this was the test. He was checking right now in the first 30 seconds to see if she'd fold. Apologize too hard, get flustered, backpedal into helplessness. She'd seen it before. Powerful men who turned every interaction into a small dominance exercise, checking the structural integrity of the people they were dealing with before deciding whether to bother engaging. "You're right," she said. "It doesn't. Should we start?" Something shifted in his expression, so small she might have imagined it, but she didn't think she imagined it. "Sit down," he said. The presentation was supposed to take 45 minutes. She'd rehearsed it until she could deliver it in her sleep, had the data solid, had the creative direction compelling, had 3 case studies from comparable luxury hospitality clients that demonstrated exactly the kind of results she was promising. It took 11 minutes before Luca Moretti started taking it apart. Not aggressively. Worse than aggressively. Surgically. He sat at the head of the table with his hands flat on the surface and picked apart her proposals with the kind of methodical precision that told her he'd already read everything she'd submitted in advance, had thought about it carefully, and had identified every weakness before she'd opened her mouth. This campaign model assumes a 15% increase in direct bookings through digital channels. Your case study from the Hartwell Hotel Group shows 11%. Where's the other 4% coming from? Demographic shift in the 30 to 45 luxury travel bracket, combined with the post-pandemic recovery in international tourism. The data projects, he said, not demonstrates. Projections based on 3 years of market data from comparable is not identical. No projection ever is, she said, and she kept her voice level, kept her hand still on the edge of her portfolio. If you're looking for certainty in a marketing strategy, that's not something any firm can honestly offer you. What I can offer you is a strategy built on the strongest available evidence, executed by a team with a documented track record in exactly this sector. He looked at her. That ocean in January look. Your firm had a revenue decline of 22% in the last fiscal year. She hadn't expected that. She kept her face from showing it, but just barely. He'd gone outside the hospitality metrics, outside what she'd submitted. He'd done his own research on her. We did, she said. Why should I trust a marketing firm that can't market itself out of a revenue decline? Because the decline was the result of internal structural issues that have been identified and addressed, not a failure of strategy or creative execution. Our client retention rate over the same period was 91%. The work speaks for itself. The work speaks for itself, he repeated, like he was deciding whether to agree. Does your research show otherwise? The question landed in the room. The three other people at the table went very still. She had the impression that nobody asked Luca Moretti rhetorical questions, or questions that implied he might be wrong, or really questions of any kind that carried any kind of edge. The corner of his mouth did something, not a smile, the shadow of a smile, a recognition of something. No, he said. It doesn't. The presentation resumed. He continued taking it apart, and she continued putting it back together, and somewhere in the second hour the meeting transformed from a pitch into an argument, and then from an argument into something that felt, strangely, almost like a conversation. He pushed hard, and she pushed back hard, and the three other people in the room became essentially furniture. At some point, Clara appeared in the doorway and said something about a 7 o'clock call, and Luca said, "Reschedule it," without looking away from Selena, and Clara disappeared again. At 9:10, he leaned back in his chair and looked at her with those gray eyes and said, "I'll have my team review the revised proposal." It wasn't a yes. But it wasn't a no either, and she'd walked in expecting a no, so she packed up her portfolio and told herself it was progress. She was 3 steps from the elevator when she heard voices from a room she hadn't registered on the way in. A side office off the main corridor, door not fully latched, sound carrying through the gap. She should have kept walking. She didn't. Not because she was nosy or reckless or anything as simple as that. She stopped because she heard her own name. The Vaughn woman. Is she a liability? Unknown yet. If she gets the contract, she's in the building regularly. That's a variable, said a third voice she didn't recognize. And we have 30 days, Luca. 30 days before the council meeting. The Delacroix faction already has the votes unless I know the timeline. Then you know you need a wife, not in 6 months, not after the next quarter, in 30 days, or they strip the leadership and hand it to Marco, and everything your father built becomes, I said I know the timeline. Luca's voice, cold, absolute. Selena's hand was on the elevator button. She pressed it. The doors opened immediately, silently, and she stepped inside and the doors closed behind her and she rode down 70 floors without breathing. She stood on the sidewalk in the rain and tried to process what she'd just heard. A 30-day deadline, a council vote, something about leadership, about a man named Marco, about everything his father built being at stake, and Luca Moretti's voice saying, I know the timeline in the tone of a man who was running out of options and would not admit it to anyone, ever, under any circumstances. She needed a wife. The thought was so strange she almost laughed. The most powerful man in New York, possibly the most dangerous, depending on which rumors about the Moretti family's actual business interests you believed. And he was standing on the 70th floor of his own building, looking out at a city he supposedly controlled. And he needed a wife in 30 days, or he was going to lose everything. She walked to the curb and raised her arm for a cab. She was 3 blocks south on Lexington when her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. Ms. Vaughn. She recognized the voice immediately, and her stomach dropped 6 floors. Mr. Moretti. I'd like to continue our conversation. The proposal review. A different conversation, he said. Tomorrow morning, my office, 8 o'clock. She stood on the wet sidewalk with the cab stopped in front of her and the door open and rain soaking her good coat for the second time that night. I'll be there, she said. She didn't sleep. That wasn't unusual. Sleep had become something she negotiated with rather than something she simply did. A currency she bartered against anxiety. against the spreadsheets she kept running in her head, against the memory of sitting across from her father 8 months ago while he explained, in the careful, controlled voice of a man who had been rehearsing this conversation for months, exactly how bad things had gotten. The second mortgage he'd taken on the family house in Westchester, the personal loans he'd used to prop up the company's cash flow, the credit lines he'd extended beyond any rational limit. Selena had sat there and listened and not cried because she was her mother's daughter, and her mother did not cry at bad news. And when her father finished talking, she'd asked 3 practical questions and then gone home and sat in the dark in her apartment for 2 hours before she allowed herself to feel anything. She'd felt a lot of things. Most of them had calcified by now into something more functional: determination, stubbornness, the kind of exhausted anger that makes excellent fuel. She lay in her apartment and stared at the ceiling and thought about what she'd overheard. She thought about it practically, which was the only way she knew how to think about anything that scared her. She'd overheard a private conversation. She didn't know the full context. What she thought she'd understood could be wrong, could be incomplete, could mean something entirely different from what it appeared to mean on the surface, except she'd heard his voice when he said, "I know the timeline." She'd spent 2 hours in a room with Luca Moretti, watching him take apart every weakness in her proposals with perfect precision, and she understood by now how he sounded when he was in control of a situation and how he sounded when he was managing one. Those were different sounds. She'd heard the second one through that door. She thought about 30 employees at Vaughn Creative who had families and mortgages of their own. She thought about her father, who called her every Sunday and never asked about money directly, but whose voice had gotten thinner in the last 2 years in a way that had nothing to do with his health. She thought about her own account balance and what it looked like. She turned off the light and stared at the dark ceiling and told herself she was not going to walk into Luca Moretti's office tomorrow and suggest what she was already half thinking, because that was insane. That was the kind of thing that only happened in situations people invented for entertainment purposes and not in real life. She thought about it for 4 more hours, then the alarm went off. She got up, showered, put on her best remaining suit, navy, fitted, the one she wore for the most important meetings, and took a cab to Moretti Tower. He was already at his desk when Clara showed her in. The 70th floor in daylight was different. The rain was gone, and Manhattan spread out behind him in hard October clarity, all angles and sun on glass and water in the harbor in the distance. He looked different in daylight too, though she couldn't have said exactly how. Just as contained, just as unreadable, but somehow more real, which was the wrong word, except she didn't have a better one. "Close the door," he said, without looking up. She closed it. Sat down across from him without being asked, which she could see registered with him, though he didn't comment. "The proposal," he said. "I've decided to proceed." She kept her face still. "I'm glad to hear that. But that's not why I called you back." She waited. He set down the pen he'd been holding, looked at her directly for the first time since she'd walked in, and there was something different in how he was looking at her, a calculation she hadn't seen in the conference room last night, something more specific. "What did you hear?" he said. "Last night, in the corridor." It wasn't a question. He already knew. Of course he already knew. She'd been standing there in the corridor for however many seconds it took for the elevator to arrive, and he had a whole building full of people whose job was to notice things. She could have denied it. He couldn't prove what she'd heard exactly, but she looked at him across the desk and understood that lying to this man would be a mistake of a different category entirely from anything else she could do wrong in this room. "Enough," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. "Then you understand why this conversation is happening." "I understand that you have a timeline," she said carefully, "and that you need to address something on a very specific schedule." That's a diplomatic way to put it. He folded his hands on the desk. "What I need, Ms. Vaughn, is a wife. I need one within the next 30 days. And I need someone who is intelligent enough to function in complicated social environments, composed enough to not be destabilized by pressure, and practical enough to understand the nature of a contractual arrangement without developing complications." Selena sat with that for exactly 3 seconds. "You're asking me," she said. "I'm presenting you with an arrangement. You've known me for 2 hours. I've known about you for considerably longer. The Moretti acquisition team does thorough research on principals and potential contracts." He paused. "You're 30 days from missing payroll." The words landed like something physical. She didn't flinch, but she felt them. That's private financial. Nothing about companies is private when the right people look. You know that. He wasn't cruel about it. He was just stating a fact the way he stated all facts, directly, without insulation. You're holding the company together through considerable personal financial strain. Your credit is nearly exhausted, and the Moretti hospitality contract, while helpful, would not solve the immediate cash flow problem in time. She hated that he was right. She hated more that he knew he was right, and she knew he was right, and they were both just sitting here in the clarity of it. "What are the terms?" she said. He reached into a drawer and placed a document on the desk between them. It was already prepared, which meant he'd had it prepared last night after she left, which meant he'd made a decision about this before he called her, which meant she didn't finish the thought. 1 year, he said, you would live in the penthouse residence. You would be presented to my family and to the relevant social and business communities as my wife. You would be required to attend certain events, meet certain people, fulfill certain public-facing obligations consistent with that role. He paused. In exchange, Vaughn Creative receives the full Moretti hospitality contract, effective immediately, and you personally receive a payment of $1.2 million upon signing, with an additional $800,000 upon completion of the year held in escrow. The number sat between them on the desk like something she was afraid to touch. $2 million. And the contract. All of it, together. It would clear the personal debt. It would stabilize the company for years. It would give her enough runway to actually fix what her father had broken instead of just running from the collapse. The marriage would be in name only, she said. Not a question. She needed it on the table, stated plainly. Correct. Separate bedrooms. No expectations beyond what is publicly required. A full legal agreement specifying all terms and a clear dissolution process at the end of 12 months. And if someone finds out the arrangement is contractual? That would be a problem for both of us, he said, which is why it's in both of our interests to ensure no one does. Selena looked at the document on the desk. She didn't pick it up. She looked at it the way you look at something when you're trying to see all the way around it at once, trying to find the angle you've missed. You don't know me, she said. I know enough. That's not the same as knowing me. No, he said. It isn't. He looked at her steadily. Last night you held your position in a conversation that most people do not survive professionally. You told the truth when you could have deflected. You didn't perform confidence. You had it, and you deployed it selectively. A pause. That's what I need. Not a performance. Not someone who can be scared into compliance. Someone who can stand in a difficult room and make it believable. Selena thought about 30 people who came to work every day and trusted her to keep the lights on. She thought about her father's voice getting thinner on Sunday phone calls. She thought about all the nights she'd spent staring at the ceiling and all the mornings she'd gotten up anyway and kept moving. I need 48 hours, she said. You have 24. She stood up, picked up her bag, looked at him one more time, and he was looking back at her with those January gray eyes and absolutely nothing readable in them. I'll call you, she said. She left. She spent the 24 hours not calling her lawyer because her lawyer would talk her out of it, and not calling her best friend Dana because Dana would also talk her out of it, and not calling her father because that conversation was one she would not be able to have honestly until she knew what she'd decided. She spent the 24 hours walking around the city in the cold and thinking. She thought about risk. She thought about desperation and what it costs a person when they let it make decisions for them. She thought about what it would mean to spend a year of her life inside someone else's world, a world she didn't fully understand, pretending something that wasn't true, surrounded by people she'd never met in circumstances she couldn't completely predict. She thought about the alternative. At 6:45 the following morning, she called the unknown number. He picked up on the second ring. No hello. I'll do it, she said, but I have conditions. A beat of silence. List them. She listed them. 3. Specifically, a separate legal team of her own choosing to review the contract before signing, a clause allowing early dissolution if either party violated the stated terms, and a provision protecting her existing Vaughn Creative employees from any negative impact related to the arrangement should it become public. Another beat. Acceptable, he said. She closed her eyes, opened them. Then we have a deal. I'll have Clara send you the documentation by end of day. We'll sign Wednesday. The ceremony will be Friday. Friday, she repeated. That's 3 days. I'm aware of that. She stood in her apartment kitchen in the early morning dark, her coffee going cold on the counter, and stared at the wall and thought, what have I done? But she already knew the answer to that. She'd done what she had to do. She'd done what her mother would have called survival, and what her father would have called reckless, and what she herself could only call the most frightening and possibly most practical decision of her entire adult life. On Friday, in a small private ceremony in a Manhattan attorney's office with 2 witnesses she'd never met before and wouldn't see again, Selena Rose Vaughn signed her name on a legal marriage certificate and became, in the eyes of New York state law, Mrs. Selena Moretti. Luca signed his name beside hers without ceremony, without sentiment, without even looking up from the document until it was done. Then he stood, buttoned his jacket, and looked at her with those gray eyes. "Welcome to my world," he said. She thought there was something she was supposed to say back, something equal to that, something that matched it in composure and control. She said nothing, because standing there in that attorney's office in her navy suit with a wedding certificate in her hands that she'd signed for money and necessity and survival, she had the sudden, very clear, and deeply unwelcome feeling that she had just made a decision that was going to change her in ways she couldn't yet name or measure. She just didn't know yet whether that change was going to save her or destroy her. The black car was waiting outside when they emerged. Rain again. Of course it was raining. This city seemed determined to make every significant moment of her life wetter than necessary. Luca held the door for her with the impeccable courtesy of a man who had been trained from birth to perform certain gestures. And she got in, and he got in beside her, and the car pulled into traffic. She watched the city move past the window. She was married to a man she didn't know. She was sitting beside someone who might be dangerous in ways she hadn't yet fully reckoned with, about to go live inside his world on terms she'd negotiated in 24 hours of exhausted clarity, and she had absolutely no idea what happened next. The penthouse was on the 72nd floor, and when the elevator doors opened into it for the first time, enormous, immaculate, floor-to-ceiling windows showing Manhattan in every direction, dark leather and pale stone, and the kind of silence that serious money bought. Selena stood in the entrance and understood, for the first time in a real physical way, exactly what she'd walked into. Not just a contract, not just an arrangement, a world, his world. And she was in it now, and the doors had already closed behind her, and somewhere below them, the Moretti family was already being told that Luca had taken a wife. She didn't know yet that one of them hadn't believed it for a single second. She didn't know yet that someone in that family was already watching her, waiting, looking for the evidence they were certain was there. She didn't know yet that surviving the next 12 months was going to require a great deal more than composure and a signed document. She stood at the window in Luca Moretti's penthouse and watched the city in the rain and held herself very still. And in the reflection in the glass, she could see him standing in the doorway across the room, watching her. Neither of them spoke. The contract was signed. The clock had started. And somewhere in the building below them, a woman named Isabella Moretti, 81 years old, sharp as a blade, and wrong about almost nothing in her entire long life, set down her glass of wine and told the room she was in, quietly and without drama, that her grandson had not married for love, and that she intended to find out exactly what he had married for. Isabella Moretti did not sleep well on a good night, and this had not been a good night. She sat in the wing-back chair by the window of her suite on the 48th floor of the Moretti building. She had never lived in the penthouse, had refused it when her son Antonio offered it to her 20 years ago, had told him that a woman who slept 70 floors above the ground lost her sense of what anything was actually worth. And she held her wine glass and looked at the city and thought about her grandson's face when he'd called to tell her he was married. Not the words, the face. She'd been on a video call, had seen him on the small screen of her phone, and what she'd seen was a man delivering information he had pre-organized into a shape he believed was convincing. Luca was many things. He was cold in ways that sometimes frightened even her, and she had known frightening men her entire life. He was brilliant in the specific way of people who learned early that survival required thinking faster than everyone around them. He had his father's jaw and his grandfather's patience, and something behind his eyes that belonged entirely to himself, something she'd never been able to fully name in 34 years of watching him grow from a difficult, watchful child into the man who now controlled an empire. But he was a terrible liar. He had always been a terrible liar, which was why he had learned, very young, to simply say nothing instead. He had not said nothing on that call. He had explained carefully and thoroughly about Selena Vaughn, about their relationship, about a courtship conducted privately because of the pressures of the council timeline, about a decision made quickly because the circumstances required it. He had given her details, dates, specific anecdotes constructed to sound spontaneous. Isabella had listened to all of it and said, "I see," and asked 3 questions about the woman's family background and professional history, and Luca had answered all 3 with the same prepared fluency, and when the call ended, she had sat in her chair for a long time. Then she had told her assistant to arrange a family dinner for Sunday. She wanted to see this woman in person. She wanted to see how she sat at a table, how she held her fork, how she responded to pressure applied gently from a direction she wouldn't immediately identify as pressure. She wanted to see how Luca looked at her, and whether it was real or performed, because those 2 things looked almost identical from a distance, but were completely different up close. And Isabella Moretti had spent 81 years getting up close to things. Sunday was 4 days away. She refilled her wine glass and watched the city and waited. Selena woke up in the penthouse on Saturday morning to the sound of silence so complete it felt like a presence in the room. She lay still for a moment and stared at the ceiling of a bedroom that was larger than her entire apartment in Brooklyn, in a bed that cost more than her monthly salary, under sheets so fine they felt like something between fabric and air, and thought, "This is insane. This is genuinely insane." Then she got up because lying in the insanity did not improve it. The penthouse in daylight was different again from what it had been the night before. More human somehow. Impersonal in the specific way of spaces that had been designed rather than lived in, but impersonal in a way that had its own kind of austere logic. She found the kitchen after 2 wrong turns, a vast pale stone space with equipment that looked professional grade, and made coffee in the machine that took her 6 minutes to figure out because it was the kind of machine that had no visible buttons and operated on what appeared to be pure intimidation. She was standing out of the window with her coffee when Luca appeared. He'd been up for a while. She could tell by the way he moved, not the careful containment of someone just surfacing, but the settled, deliberate quality of someone who had already been awake for hours and had already made decisions she wasn't aware of. He was in dark trousers and a shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbows, and he looked at her across the kitchen with those gray eyes and said, "There's a briefing at 9. "Good morning to you too," she said. Something crossed his face. Not quite embarrassment, more like a recalibration. "Good morning. What kind of briefing?" "About who you are." He poured himself coffee with the efficiency of someone who had done it 10,000 times in this kitchen. "My household staff, my personal security team, and my chief of staff need to understand the current situation. There are protocols." "Protocols," she repeated. "Security arrangements, communication procedures, how you interact with staff, what you say to whom, what you don't say." He looked at her over his coffee. "How much you know about my family?" "I know what's publicly available." "Then you know almost nothing." He set his cup down. "Sit down. We have an hour before the briefing, and there are things you need to understand before you're in a room with my people." She sat. He sat across from her, and for the next 50 minutes he talked, and she listened, and the picture he drew of the Moretti family structure and the world it operated inside was considerably more complicated and considerably more dangerous than anything she'd pieced together from business profiles and rumors. The empire, that was the word he used, flatly, without drama, just a descriptor, had 3 operational layers. The legitimate business holdings, hotels, real estate, a logistics company, 2 private equity portfolios. The semi-legitimate layer, certain political relationships, certain regulatory accommodations, certain arrangements with law enforcement that existed in the gray space where money and power met governance. And the third layer, which he described with the same flat precision as the other 2, and which was the layer that required the council, required the marriage, required the entire architecture of control that his father had built and that Luca had inherited and was now fighting to hold. She sat across from him and listened to a man describe a criminal empire like it was a corporate org chart, and felt the particular specific discomfort of understanding that she had signed a contract with someone she had not fully known the nature of, and that the terms of that contract now existed inside a context far larger and darker than she'd calculated. "Are you telling me this because you trust me?" she said when he stopped. "Or because I need to know it to be useful?" He looked at her. "Both. The second one more than the first, currently." "Fair enough." She wrapped both hands around her coffee. "The third layer. Does it touch me? Can it touch me?" "Not directly. Not if the arrangement holds. And if it doesn't hold?" He was quiet for a moment. "Then we have bigger problems than your exposure." The briefing lasted 2 hours. His chief of staff was a man named Dominic Reyes, 40-something, compact, with watchful dark eyes, and the specific quality of absolute loyalty she associated with people who had been through something bad alongside the person they were loyal to. He ran through the protocols with her the way a military trainer would run through operational procedures: clear, thorough, no unnecessary commentary. The security detail assigned to her was 4 people on rotation. She would have one with her at all times outside the penthouse. Inside, the building's own security covered everything below floor 60. She was given a phone, clean, new, separate from her personal number, and told to use it for all communications that involved Luca or the family. She was given a list of events on the calendar for the next 30 days and told to review it before Monday. She reviewed it that night and counted 12 separate events: dinners, charity functions, a formal gala, 2 business receptions. Social appearances that were not, she understood by now, simply social. Her own phone buzzed around 7. "Dana? Selena. Call me. I heard from Marcus at Kingsley that you signed the Moretti contract. Is that true? Why didn't you tell me? Are you okay?" She stared at the message for a while. Then she typed back, "Yes, I signed. Everything's fine. Talk soon." She put the phone face down on the counter and did not call Dana, because Dana would hear her voice and know immediately that everything was not fine, or at least not fine in the ordinary sense, and she was not ready for that conversation yet. She was not ready to say out loud, to someone who actually knew her, what she had done and why she had done it, and what it felt like to be sitting in a stranger's penthouse, in a marriage that existed on paper and pressure and 2 people's separate desperation. Sunday arrived the way Sundays do when you're dreading something, too fast and already heavy before you're fully awake. The family dinner was at 7. The Moretti family residence in the West Village, a 4-story townhouse that managed to look both old money, understated, and quietly fortified, which she supposed was the point. They arrived together, which was the point of that too. She wore the black dress she'd borrowed from Dana, which she had not yet returned, which Dana didn't know about yet, which was the least of the problems currently stacked up in her life. Luca's hand was at the small of her back when they walked in. Light. Professional, the practiced gesture of a man putting on a performance he'd already scripted. She was 3 steps inside when she saw Isabella Moretti. The woman was in a chair at the far end of the sitting room, and she had the quality of people who don't need to fill a room with noise or movement because they simply occupy it more completely than everyone else. 81 years old, but nothing soft about her. Sharp features, dark eyes that had been watching Selena since the moment she walked through the door, and an expression of absolute pleasant neutrality that Selena recognized immediately as a mask of a very specific kind. This woman was already deciding something about her. "Selena." Luca's voice low. "My grandmother, Isabella." She walked toward her and shook her hand and said, "It's a pleasure to meet you." And Isabella's hand was dry and cool and strong for a woman her age, and she held Selena's hand a beat longer than necessary, while those dark eyes moved over her face with the systematic efficiency of someone reading a document for errors. "Sit with me," Isabella said. It was not a request. Luca's mother was across the room, talking to a man Selena didn't recognize, and she felt the glance, brief, assessing, already hostile, before Renata Moretti turned back to her conversation. Luca's sister Valentina materialized from somewhere near the kitchen and introduced herself with warm eyes and a handshake that felt genuine and said, "I've been looking forward to meeting you," in a way that actually sounded true, which was so different from everything else in the room that Selena almost felt dizzy. She sat beside Isabella. "My grandson tells me you met through the hospitality contract negotiations," Isabella said. "That's right." "And that the relationship developed quickly." "It did." Isabella tilted her head very slightly. How quickly? Fast enough that it surprised me, Selena said, which was technically completely accurate. It surprised everyone. Isabella's voice was mild. Her eyes were not. Luca has not brought a woman home in 4 years. He has not spoken of anyone seriously in considerably longer than that. And now, a pause. A wife. People change their minds about timing, Selena said. People do, Isabella agreed. Luca does not. She reached for her wine glass. He has a council meeting in 26 days. Selena kept her face perfectly still. He mentioned it. Did he explain what it means? In general terms. In general terms, Isabella repeated. She took a small sip of wine, set the glass down with precise care. My dear, I have been watching men in this family navigate power for 60 years. I know what a strategic decision looks like. She looked at Selena directly. I am not asking you to confess anything. I am telling you that I see clearly. And I'm telling you that if this is what I think it is, you should understand that I am not your enemy. Selena held those dark eyes for a long moment. I don't know what you think it is, she said carefully. Isabella almost smiled. No, you wouldn't say. She looked across the room at Luca, who was in conversation with 2 men near the fireplace. He chose well, at least. Whatever the reason. She turned back to Selena. Survive the dinner. My daughter-in-law will try to destabilize you. Don't let her. Then Valentina appeared with a second glass of wine, and the conversation moved on, and Selena sat with the strange, disorienting realization that she had just been simultaneously seen through and possibly protected by the most dangerous person in the room. Renata Moretti came for her over the main course. It was done with the smooth social cruelty of a woman who had spent decades performing violence with silverware and eye contact. Renata was 60, immaculate, with Luca's same capacity for cold precision deployed in an entirely different register. She asked Selena about her family with the warmth of someone filling out a damage assessment form. Your father's company had some difficulties recently, didn't it? A difficult period, yes. We've stabilized. Marketing, was it? Or advertising? I always confuse the two. Marketing strategy and creative execution. We work primarily in luxury hospitality. How convenient, said with a smile that meant the opposite of convenient. And before that, the family business was always marketing? My father built the firm from the ground up, yes. And what did your family do before that? Where did you grow up? Selena looked at her. Westchester. My father was the first in his family to start a business. My mother taught high school English. She said it levelly, without apology. I grew up ordinary and worked for everything I have. I'm not sure that should be a problem for anyone at this table. Silence fell across that end of the dinner table like a dropped glass. Renata's expression didn't change, but something behind it hardened into something more direct. I know what you meant, Selena said, quietly, without heat, and I'm happy to answer any actual questions you have about me. Luca, from across the table, said nothing, but she felt him watching her. Had been feeling him watching her for the last 30 minutes, actually, since before Renata started in on her, and she didn't know what the look meant because she didn't know him well enough yet to read him. And that specific ignorance was one of the most disorienting parts of her current situation. The dinner ended. They left together, in the car, and drove back uptown in silence for 5 blocks before Luca said, My mother. I handled it. I saw. Another 2 blocks. Isabella spoke to you for a while, he said. She did. What did she say? Selena looked at the city moving past the window. She said she's not my enemy. Luca was quiet for a moment. She's not, but she's also not someone whose good opinion should make you comfortable. Her not being your enemy and her being on your side are different things. I understand that. Do you? She turned to look at him. He was watching the road, profile sharp in the passing light. I grew up understanding that rooms full of people smiling at you were not the same as rooms full of people who wished you well. I've been navigating that since I was 12 years old, at my father's business dinners, where I was the scholarship kid's daughter and everyone knew it. She paused. I know how to read a room, Luca. He looked at her then, just for a second. Something shifted in the gray eyes. He looked back at the road. The gala on Thursday, he said. There will be people there from the council. You need to be prepared for that. Tell me about them, he told her. For the rest of the drive and then in the kitchen of the penthouse after midnight over coffee, he laid out the council's composition. 12 men, 3 factions, the balance of power currently tilting toward a man named Marco Delacroix, who had been building alliances for 2 years in preparation for exactly this moment. Marco's argument was that Luca was too young, too autonomous, too unwilling to share decision-making with the larger body. His real argument, which everyone understood, was that Luca had too much power and Marco wanted it. Does Marco know about the timeline, she asked, the deadline that triggered this? Marco created the deadline, Luca said. He's the one who pushed the marriage requirement through the council bylaws 18 months ago. He anticipated I'd either comply by bringing in someone from one of the approved family networks, which would compromise my independence, or refuse and hand him the grounds to challenge my leadership. Selena stared at him. He forced your hand. Yes, and you found a third option. I found you. She sat with that. The coffee had gone cold and she didn't care. He's going to look at me and immediately start trying to find the weakness. Yes. So I need to be completely solid. No cracks. No moments of, yes. Thursday, she said. Thursday. She looked at him across the kitchen. He looked back at her. There was something different about this specific moment, in this specific quiet, the city dark and enormous outside the glass, from all the other moments she'd had with him in the last 6 days. Something that wasn't the careful performance of a business arrangement. Something that was just 2 people sitting in the same kitchen at 1 a.m, tired in similar ways, both carrying weight they'd been carrying alone for a long time. She didn't name it. Naming it would have been the wrong move. Get some sleep, he said. You too, she said. She went to bed and did not sleep for a long time. Thursday came. The gala was at the Metropolitan, a fundraiser for a children's arts education foundation that served, as these events always did in Luca's world, as a public forum for conversations that could not happen anywhere less elegant. She wore a midnight blue gown that had appeared in her closet without explanation that morning. Valentina, she suspected, who had texted her the previous day with what appeared to be unsolicited but accurate observations about what to wear, and she stood beside Luca in the receiving line and met 50 people in 40 minutes and filed away everything she observed about each of them with the careful, methodical focus she usually reserved for market analysis. Marco Delacroix found her an hour in. He was not what she'd expected from Luca's description. She'd expected something overtly threatening. What she got instead was a man of perhaps 60, silver-haired, with a warm handshake and the face of someone's agreeable uncle and the eyes of something else entirely. Steady and measuring and about as warm as the January ocean she'd come to associate with a completely different person's gaze. Mrs. Moretti, he said, I've been hoping for the chance to meet you. Mr. Delacroix. She smiled at him. The feeling is mutual. I understand you run your own firm, said with genuine interest, performing over something else. That's right, we've just taken on the Moretti hospitality portfolio. Convenient timing, he said. Same words Renata had used. A coincidence, she thought, and then didn't think it was a coincidence. Business and personal life overlap sometimes. I don't think that's unusual. No, he agreed, though it can create certain questions about motivation, about what brings people together. He let that sit for exactly the right amount of time. You must have made quite an impression on Luca. He made quite an impression on me, she said. I'm sure. His smile didn't shift. We'll have to get you to one of the council dinners soon, get to know you properly. Luca keeps himself rather isolated. It's good that he has someone now, someone we can all get to know. Someone we can investigate, she translated perfectly. Someone whose seams we can look for. I'd like that, she said warmly. I'm an open book. He laughed at that. A real laugh, she thought, because she'd said exactly the right thing with exactly the right confidence, and he'd heard it and recalibrated slightly, and she could feel him doing it. I'm sure you are, he said. Enjoy your evening. He moved away through the crowd, and she stood there for a moment and let out a breath that she kept controlled enough that nobody watching would have seen it. Luca appeared at her elbow. Delacroix. Yes. How was it? Fine. She reached for a glass from a passing tray. He's good. Better than I expected. What did he say? She told him. Luca listened with his face still and his eyes on the middle distance, and when she finished, he said, "He'll have someone following up on your background within 48 hours. I know. The contract, if they won't find what doesn't exist electronically." She looked at him. "The physical documents are with my personal attorney, separate from all Moretti legal infrastructure." "You said that." "I said it," he paused. "The original drafts existed on Dominic's secure server. I had them deleted." "When?" 3 days ago." She absorbed that. "You should have told me." "I'm telling you now." "That's not the same." "No," he said, and there was something in his voice, the first genuine crack she'd heard in it, something underneath the control. "It isn't. I'm aware it isn't." He looked at her. "There are things about how I operate that I'm not going to be able to explain in advance every time. The world I work in doesn't always allow for that." "Then you need to tell me the rules," she said. "Not after, before. If I'm in this, I'm in it completely, but I cannot be blindsided in a room full of people who are already looking for cracks." He was very still. "You're right," he said. She hadn't expected him to say that. The straightforwardness of it caught her off balance in a way that 3 days of social warfare had not managed to. They stood side by side in the crowded gala and looked at each other for a moment, and something moved between them in that moment, something that didn't have a clean name yet, something that was made of exhaustion and proximity, and the strange, specific intimacy of two people who had been pretending something hard enough that the line between performance and actual experience had begun, just slightly, to blur. Then his phone buzzed, and he looked at it, and his face went absolutely flat. "What?" she said. He turned the phone so she could see the screen. It was a message from Dominic. 4 words and an image attachment. The 4 words were, "Someone has the contract." The image was a photograph. Blurred, taken from a distance, but clear enough. A single page of a legal document, time-stamped 3 weeks ago, with both their signatures visible at the bottom. Someone had a copy of the marriage contract. Someone had been holding it for 3 weeks and had chosen tonight, in this room, to let Luca know they had it. Selena stood in the middle of the Metropolitan Gala with 500 people around her and felt the floor shift under her feet in a way that had nothing to do with the heels she was wearing. "Who?" she said, her voice completely level. Luca's jaw was tight. His eyes had gone to a place past cold. "I don't know yet." "How long do we have before—" "I don't know that either." She looked at the room, at Marco Delacroix, laughing with a group across the floor, at the council members she'd spent the last hour memorizing, at the 500 people in their expensive clothes who had no idea that everything was about to get significantly more complicated. She looked at her husband, her contract husband, the man she'd known for 11 days, the man she'd married for money and survival and a practical calculation about the least bad option available, and understood that they had just passed the point where any of this could be walked back. The contract existed. Someone had it. And whoever that person was, they had waited for exactly the right moment to make sure Luca knew. Tonight had been the opening move. Whatever came next was going to be considerably worse. The ride back from the Metropolitan was 23 minutes. Selena counted them. Not because she was watching the clock, but because her brain had defaulted to the only coping mechanism it had ever actually trusted: measurement, sequence, the hard edges of quantifiable things. And the city outside the car window had become a blur of light and water on glass that her eyes passed over without registering anything. Luca was on the phone for 17 of those 23 minutes. 3 separate calls. She could follow the shape of the conversations without understanding the specifics. The first one was Dominic, clipped and operational, coordinates being confirmed, something being locked down. The second was someone whose name she didn't catch, shorter, ending with Luca saying, "Nothing moves until I say so," in a voice she hadn't heard from him yet, a voice that belonged to a different register entirely from the one he used in boardrooms and family dinners. The third call he made in Italian, low and fast, and she caught maybe 1 word in 8. He hung up and put the phone in his jacket pocket and stared straight ahead. "Talk to me," she said. "Not in the car." "Luca, not in the car." Final. No heat in it, which somehow made it harder to push against than if there had been. She looked back at the window. The penthouse felt different when they walked into it. She didn't know if it actually was different, or if she was just carrying something that changed the quality of the air around her, but the silence had a weight to it tonight that she didn't remember from before. She pulled the pins out of her hair in the entryway because the tension headache that had been building since the moment she'd seen that phone screen had graduated into something serious, and dropped them on the side table and followed Luca into the study. He was already at this bar cabinet when she walked in. 2 glasses, 2 fingers of something dark. He handed her one without asking, and she took it without comment. "Sit down," he said. "I'd rather stand." He looked at her briefly, then let it go. He stood across the room with his own glass and said, "The image Dominic sent. It was taken from our signed copy, not a scan of the attorney's filing, our copy, the one that was supposed to be in the secured document storage on the 49th floor." "Supposed to be," she said. "It's still there. The document itself hasn't been removed. Someone photographed it, which means someone with access to secured storage, level 4 clearance, took that photograph and has been sitting on it for 3 weeks. 3 weeks? She ran the timeline backward in her head. 3 weeks ago was 2 days after the signing. 2 days after she'd stood in that attorney's office and written her name next to his. Someone knew before the family announcement, she said. Yes. Before the public announcement. Yes. Which means someone inside your operation knew about the arrangement before you told anyone. Luca's jaw tightened. Yes. She set her glass down on the edge of his desk because her hand had developed a faint tremor she didn't want him to see, and holding something made it visible. How many people knew before the announcement about the structure of the arrangement, the timeline, the contract itself? Dominic, my attorney, the 2 witnesses at the signing, both vetted. He paused. And whoever they told. You trust Dominic? Completely. Your attorney? 20 years. Yes. The witnesses. He was quiet for a moment. One of them is my cousin Raphael. The other is a man named Stein who has handled sensitive legal matters for the family for 15 years. Another pause, slightly longer. Raphael. He said the name the way you say something you've been not saying for a while. Tell me about Raphael, she said. Luca turned away from her and walked to the window. She watched his reflection in the dark glass, the set of his shoulders, the way he held his glass, the specific stillness of someone doing internal damage assessment. Raphael Moretti is my father's brother's son, 8 years older than me. He was passed over for leadership when my father died because the council determined he lacked the operational capacity. A beat. He has never accepted that determination. And you invited him to witness the signing. He requested to be present, his family. I allowed it because refusing would have created a different problem. He turned around. I didn't consider that he would. You didn't think your own family would move against you. The words landed flat in the room. He didn't argue with them. Do you know for certain it was him? She asked. Not yet. But it was him, Luca said. And the way he said it, not angry, not loud, just settled and certain in the way of someone who has finished a calculation they didn't want to finish, told her that he'd already known, somewhere, and that tonight had only confirmed it. She stood in the study of a penthouse she'd lived in for 11 days and looked at her contract husband and understood something she hadn't fully understood before. The world she had walked into was not just complicated, it was actively predatory. And every person in it, including possibly everyone in this building, was running their own game with their own stakes. And she had arrived 11 days ago with a marketing portfolio and a desperate family situation and had stepped directly into the middle of something that had been building for years before she existed. What does he want with it? She said. Raphael, what's the move? There are 2 obvious plays. Leak it to the council and trigger a legitimacy challenge before the vote. Or use it as leverage directly. Blackmail, essentially. Come to me with the photograph and name his price. Which does he do? I don't know yet. Luca looked at her steadily. Both have the same endpoint if they succeed. You lose leadership. We lose considerably more than that, he said. If the council finds grounds to strip leadership, the transfer to Marco becomes immediate. Marco's first action will be to dissolve all current agreements, including the hospitality contracts. He paused. Including the personal financial arrangements. The money. The contract payment. Everything she'd signed for, everything she'd agreed to, everything she was currently staking a year of her life on. Gone. Not reduced. Gone. And not just the future payment. The arrangement itself would be invalid, which meant the initial payment terms were likely clawback territory depending on how the contract was structured, which she suddenly could not remember clearly enough, and that specific uncertainty made her feel sick. "I need to call my attorney," she said. "Tomorrow." "Tonight?" "Your attorney cannot help you tonight, and making that call tonight creates a paper trail that we don't need." His voice was not unkind, it was just precise. "I know this is frightening. I need you to hold it together for 12 more hours." She looked at him. "I'm not frightened," she said, and it came out with enough edge that he went quiet. "I'm angry." "Those are different things, and I need you to understand the difference, because if you spend the next 12 hours managing me like I'm a liability instead of talking to me like I'm your partner in this, we're going to have a much worse problem than Raphael." The word partner sat between them. He held her gaze for a long moment. "You're right," he said. Second time he'd said those words to her. She was starting to understand that they cost him something each time. "So talk to me," she said. "All of it. What are we doing tomorrow?" They were in that study until 3 in the morning. She learned things about the Moretti organization's power structure that she suspected very few people outside of it ever learned and remained free to discuss afterward. She learned the specific mechanics of the council vote, the quorum requirements, the challenge procedures, the narrow window within which a legitimacy challenge could be mounted and the equally narrow window within which it could be defended. She learned that Marco Delacroix had 2 council votes locked and was working on a third, and that the third was a man named Caruso, who was currently persuadable in either direction and whose decision would likely determine everything. She learned that Luca had known about Raphael's resentment for 2 years and had chosen to manage it through inclusion rather than exclusion, a strategic calculation that had just failed in the most expensive possible way. She learned that her husband, she kept stumbling on the word internally, kept having to consciously apply it, had not slept more than 5 hours at a stretch in 4 months. She learned that from watching him, not from anything he said. At 3 in the morning, she went to her room and lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and felt the specific exhaustion of a person carrying too many things at once. Her own fears, the company, the contract, the performance of a marriage, and now this. The ground shifting under everything in a way she hadn't anticipated and couldn't fully calculate. She fell asleep around 4 and woke up at 7 and started moving. 3 days passed. They were 3 of the most disorienting days of her life, and she had lived through her mother's death and her father's financial collapse, so she had a reference point for disorienting. The difference was that those previous disasters had been things happening to her from outside. This one, she was inside, moving through it, playing a role in it, and the role required her to continue performing normally in every external context while internally everything was in motion. She went into the Vaughn creative offices on Monday and Tuesday, met with her team, reviewed the early work on the Moretti hospitality campaign, had a normal conversation with Dana about creative direction for the hotel rebrand, during which Dana looked at her twice with the specific look of someone who wants to ask something and is choosing not to, which meant Dana knew something was off and was giving her space, which was the best thing Dana could have done and also made her feel guilty in a way she didn't have bandwidth to process. She attended a lunch on Tuesday with 2 of Luca's business associates and their wives and performed warmth and interest for 2.5 hours over food she barely tasted, and did it well enough that afterward one of the wives sent her a text through Luca's assistant saying she'd love to have coffee sometime. She did not hear from Raphael. Neither did Luca, which was in some ways worse than if they had. On Wednesday night, Luca found her in the kitchen at 11. She was doing what she did when she couldn't sleep and didn't want to just lie there. She was working through the Moretti hotel brand analysis on her laptop because the work was real regardless of everything else. And having something real to do with her hands and brain kept the other thing from eating her alive. He sat down across from her, didn't say anything for a moment, just sat there, which she was learning was something he did, occupied space quietly without filling it in a way that should have been uncomfortable but somehow wasn't. "Raphael called Dominic this afternoon," he said. She looked up from her screen. "And?" "He wants a meeting, tomorrow night, private. Just you. Just me. Which means he wants something he thinks he can negotiate for directly." She closed the laptop. "Which means it's the blackmail play, not the council leak. He hasn't gone to Marco yet." Correct. That's good. That's actually good. It means there's still time. It means there's still time, Luca agreed. It also means he thinks he has enough to make me deal. Do you know what he wants? Luca was quiet for a moment, set his own coffee down. My guess is a formal position, a seat at the table, recognition, another pause. He wants what he's always wanted, what he thinks he should have had when my father died. And you're going to meet with him? Yes. Alone? Yes. She looked at him. I don't like that. I'm not asking you to like it. I know you're not. I'm telling you anyway. She leaned forward on the table. If he's already made a copy of the photograph, which he has, obviously, then you meeting with him alone and making some kind of agreement doesn't solve the problem. It just delays it and creates a power dynamic where he knows he can come back. Luca looked at her with something in his eyes that was new. Not surprise exactly, more like recognition. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that whatever happens in that meeting, you go in already holding something over him. She met his gaze. Nobody makes a move like this completely clean. He's been nursing this resentment for 3 years, building towards something. That means he's made moves, reached out to people he shouldn't have reached out to, made agreements that are outside the boundaries of whatever rules govern your organization. She paused. Find those. The silence stretched between them. Dominic, Luca said finally, tonight, before the meeting. He looked at her for another long moment. Then he picked up his phone. What Dominic found took 4 hours and arrived in Luca's secured inbox at 2:47 in the morning. Selena was still awake. She heard Luca's voice from the study, a single short sentence she couldn't make out, and then silence, and then nothing for 10 minutes. And then he appeared in the kitchen doorway with his phone in his hand and a look on his face she hadn't seen before. Raphael has been in contact with Delacroix, he said. Not recently, for 14 months. She let that settle. 14 months ago is before the marriage deadline was even publicly established. Yes. So Raphael wasn't reacting to the situation. He helped create it. He was feeding Delacroix information about the organization's internal structure, about my decision-making patterns, about the council dynamics. Luca's voice was completely flat, the flatness of something beyond anger. Delacroix used that intelligence to time the marriage provision, to create a deadline he knew I'd struggle to meet in a way that didn't compromise my position. The full shape of it landed on her all at once. The marriage provision, the 30-day deadline, the perfect trap of it. Comply and concede control, refuse and lose legitimacy, find a third option, and expose yourself to exactly what was now happening. None of it had been circumstantial. It had been constructed. Built by someone with intimate knowledge of how Luca operated and what he valued and where his vulnerabilities were. Built with Raphael's help. He didn't just resent being passed over, she said slowly. He's been actively working to reverse it for over a year. Yes. And the contract photograph. That's not a power play for a seat at the table. That's leverage in a larger operation. He was always going to hand it to Delacroix. The meeting request is theater, Luca said. He wants me to show up tomorrow thinking I have room to negotiate, while the photograph is already moving. She stood up from the table. Her legs felt strange, the particular physical response to a kind of fear that was actually just her body registering the full weight of a situation it had been partially insulating her from. How much time? She said. If he's sending it to Delacroix tonight, Delacroix needs time to verify and prepare the challenge documentation. 48 hours, maybe 60. He set the phone down. The council meeting is in 19 days. He doesn't need to file the challenge tonight. He can wait until he has maximum impact, close enough to the vote that I don't have time to build a counter-narrative. So we have some time. We have some time, he said. And then, Selena. Something in the way he said her name. She looked at him. When the contract becomes public, and it will become public, regardless of what we do in the next 48 hours, this is already past the point where it can be fully contained. The story that comes out will be what we make it. He was looking at her with the careful directness of someone who has worked out what needs to be said and is not flinching from it. That story requires something more than a signed document and a practice performance at dinner parties. It requires something real, she said. Or something that looks real enough that nobody in that council chamber can prove otherwise. She stood in the kitchen at 3 in the morning and looked at the man she'd married 11 days ago for money and necessity and the least bad option, and thought about what he was actually saying, which was that the architecture of the lie they'd constructed together was no longer strong enough on its own, and that the only available reinforcement was something that couldn't be faked. Not completely, not in front of people who were actively looking for the seams. And she thought about the fact that somewhere between the conference room on the 70th floor and this kitchen at 3 in the morning, she had stopped being entirely sure that the line between the performance and the reality was as clean as it had been when they signed those papers. She hadn't said that to anyone. She had barely allowed herself to think it. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he repeated. "What do we do first?" "First," he said, "we deal with Raphael." The meeting was at 9 the following evening in a private room of a restaurant in Tribeca that the Moretti organization owned through 3 layers of holding companies. Selena was not supposed to be there. That was what had been planned. Luca would go, Dominic would cover the surrounding block, she would be in the penthouse under security. She went anyway, not against Luca's instructions. She was technically within the building, in a room 2 doors down from the private dining room, seated at a small table with Dominic's secondary and a live audio feed from the room where Luca and Raphael were sitting. She heard it all. Raphael Moretti was 52 years old and sounded, through the audio, like a man who had been building toward a specific speech for a long time and had finally arrived at the moment of delivery. He spoke with the warmth of someone who had pre-packaged his grievances into something that sounded almost reasonable. The family obligations, the years of service, the decisions made by a council that he'd never fully trusted. He spoke about Luca's father with a kind of affection that made Selena's skin crawl because it sounded genuine, which was worse, which meant the betrayal wasn't purely calculated but had actual personal feeling underneath it, which made it more dangerous. Then he said, "The photograph goes to Delacroix Friday morning unless we can reach an arrangement tonight." And Luca said very quietly, "What arrangement?" "A formal position. Advisory, voting access on major decisions, acknowledged in the organizational charter." A pause. "That's all I want. What I should have had 3 years ago." "That's all," Luca said. "That's all." Silence. 8 seconds of it. Then Luca said, "I know about the 14 months, Raphael." The quality of the silence that followed was completely different from the one before it. "I know about Delacroix. I know about the information you passed. I know about the meeting in December, the calls in February, and the specific council strategy sessions where your intelligence was used to construct the marriage provision." Luca's voice was still quiet. That was the most frightening thing about it. There was no escalation, no anger, no volume, just words, precise and final, like nails being placed one at a time. "I know all of it." Selena pressed her fingers flat against the table and breathed. "You came here tonight with leverage," Luca continued. "I'm showing you that you don't have any. The photograph reaches Delacroix. It reaches him with a complete documented history of your cooperation in a conspiracy against this family's leadership. You don't have a play, Raphael. You have exposure." Another silence, longer. "You destroy your own family." Raphael's voice had changed. The warmth was gone. What was left sounded older and rawer and genuinely shocked, which meant he hadn't believed Luca knew, had not calculated for the possibility that the intelligence ran both directions. "You already did that," Luca said. "I'm just deciding what to do about it." Selena heard the sound of a chair, someone standing. "The photograph," Luca said. "All copies. Everything you've passed to Delacroix. You're going to get it back, and you're going to bring it to me, and then you're going to resign your family council seat on grounds of health, and you're going to leave New York." A pause. "Or I show the documentation to the full council tonight and let them decide what to do with a man who actively conspired with a rival faction to destabilize family leadership." Raphael said nothing. "You have until tomorrow morning," Luca said. She heard footsteps. A door. Then silence. She sat in the small room 2 doors down and let out a breath so controlled it barely made a sound, and felt the secondary watching her from across the table, and kept her hands still. Dominic appeared in the doorway 30 seconds later. "He's out of the building." She stood up, walked down the corridor. Luca was standing in the private dining room with his back to the door, hands in his pockets. looking at the blank wall in front of him. She closed the door behind her. That was, she started. Don't. He didn't turn around. Not yet. She understood that. She stood there and let him have the 30 seconds of silence because she was starting to understand that for a man who performed control as constantly and thoroughly as Luca Moretti did, there were occasional necessary moments when the performance had to stop and the person underneath it had to just stand somewhere and absorb what had just happened. She just watched him threaten his own family, his own blood, the son of his father's brother, the man who had stood in that attorney's office as a witness to his marriage and then spent 3 weeks carrying a photograph of the contract like a weapon. She'd watched him do it in a voice so quiet it was almost gentle, and she understood by now that the quieter Luca's voice got, the more serious it was, and that the specific quietness she'd heard in that room was the sound of someone who had crossed a line they'd known was eventually coming and had crossed it anyway because there was no other direction available. She thought about what it cost him. She didn't ask, she just thought about it. He turned around. His face was arranged back into its usual containment. But the eyes. She was learning to read the eyes, and what she read in them now was a kind of exhaustion so deep it had passed through tiredness into something structural. A tiredness in the architecture of him, not just in the surface. He'll comply, he said. You think so? Yes. He's not brave. He's resentful. Those are different things. He moved toward the door. Dominic will verify the copies are destroyed. She nodded. They walked out together into the Tribeca night, cold and clear, the street quiet at this hour. His car was waiting. They got in. The city moved past the windows. She was watching his profile when his phone lit up with a notification. He looked at it. She saw it happen. The thing she'd been watching for in the 11 days she'd known him, the crack in the composure, the thing that moved through him involuntarily before he could organize it into stillness. It was brief. 3 seconds. But she caught it. She reached out and took the phone from his hand. The notification was from a news monitoring service. An alert on his name. The article had been published 4 minutes ago. A media outlet she recognized. Not tabloid, not fringe, actual legitimate press, with a headline that hit her like a physical impact. Moretti marriage, a sham? Sources claim contract marriage arranged for corporate benefit. Below the headline, 3 paragraphs. No photograph? Not yet, but specific details that could only have come from someone with direct knowledge. The timeline, the business arrangement, the financial exchange. Not Raphael. Raphael hadn't made his move yet. Raphael was supposed to be cornered. This was someone else. She looked up from the phone. Luca was looking straight ahead, and his jaw was tight, and his hands were flat on his thighs, and she recognized the quality of his stillness now. It was the stillness of a man who has just understood that the threat he thought he'd identified was only the front of something with considerably more depth to it than he'd calculated. They hadn't been dealing with Raphael. They'd been dealing with a distraction. And while Luca had spent 3 days focused on his cousin, while he'd run the intelligence operation and arranged the confrontation and played it exactly right, someone else had been moving. The car was still driving uptown. The article was already spreading. Her phone buzzed. Then again. Then 3 times in rapid succession. Dana, her attorney, an unknown number. And then she felt her stomach drop through the floor of the car. Her father's name on the screen. Her father calling at 11:30 on a Thursday night, which he had never done in her entire adult life. She answered. Selena, his voice, thin and careful, and trying not to show her something. There's a man at the house. He says he's a journalist. He's been at the door for 20 minutes, and he's asking about a pause. Selena, he's asking about a contract, something about your marriage. He says he has documents. She closed her eyes, opened them. Outside the car window, the city was still moving, still lit and enormous and indifferent, and the article was spreading through it right now the way things spread in the age of real-time information. Not slowly, not controllably, but instantly and in every direction at once, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. She looked at Luca. He was already on his phone. Dominic again. His voice low and controlled, and she could hear in it, underneath all the control, the specific sound of a man who understood that the ground had just moved in a way that could not be undone. The contract was out. Not to the council, not in a private negotiation. Out, in the world, public and spreading and already being read by people who had no context for it except the narrative the article was constructing around it. A narrative about fraud and manipulation and a mafia boss's cold calculation. A narrative that made her the instrument of it. She thought about 30 employees who came to work every day. She thought about her father standing at the door of the Westchester house she'd grown up in, with a journalist asking questions about his daughter's marriage. She thought about the contract she'd signed with the full, clear understanding of what she was doing, and how that understanding would look to anyone reading a 3-paragraph news article right now. And she felt something solidify inside her chest. Not fear, not panic. Something harder and colder and more useful than either of those things. She was done reacting. She said into her father's ear, "Go inside, lock the door, don't say anything to anyone. I'll call you in 20 minutes. She hung up. She looked at Luca. "We need to get in front of this tonight," she said. "Not tomorrow, tonight." He looked back at her and something passed between them in that look. An understanding, a crossing of some threshold they hadn't named yet. The specific moment when two people who have been operating in adjacent lanes move into the same one. "Yes," he said. "How?" He was quiet for 3 seconds. Then he said, "Together, publicly. We tell the truth before anyone else can define it for us." She held his gaze. "All of it?" "All of it." She thought about what all of it meant. The contract. The money. The desperation on both sides. The calculation they'd both made. The 11 days of pretending something that had, somewhere in the pretending, started to become something else that she still hadn't found the right word for. She thought about standing in front of the Moretti Council and the press and her father and everyone she'd ever known and saying, "Yes, this started as a transaction. Yes, I married him for money. Yes, he married me for strategic survival." And then saying what came after that. The part that was harder to say. The part that was, she realized with a clarity so sharp it almost hurt, the truest thing she currently knew. "Okay," she said. She was done surviving quietly in the margins of a world that had decided what she was before she'd opened her mouth. She was going to walk directly into the center of it, and she was going to make them all look at what was actually there. The statement went out at 12:47 in the morning, not through a PR firm, not through a lawyer. Through Luca's personal communications channel, verified and authenticated, distributed simultaneously to every major press outlet, every council member's secure contact, and every senior figure in the Moretti organizational structure. Selena wrote most of it. Not because Luca couldn't, he was precise with language in ways that most people weren't, but because she understood instinctively that this specific document needed a particular quality of voice, and that quality was not the controlled neutrality of a man who had spent his entire life performing imperviousness. It needed to sound like a human being. It needed to sound like someone who had made a decision and was not apologizing for it. They sat at the kitchen table for 40 minutes. She typed. He read over her shoulder and said 3 words the whole time. Too formal there. Cut that sentence. And once, very quietly, yes. And what emerged was 7 paragraphs that told the truth in the specific way that truth needs to be told when it's going to be read by people who are already primed to disbelieve it. Yes, the marriage had begun as a contractual arrangement. Yes, there had been financial terms. Yes, both parties had entered the agreement with practical motivations, his organizational, hers financial, and both parties had understood fully what they were agreeing to. And then the part that made her hand slow on the keyboard. What neither of us anticipated was what develops between 2 people who face difficulty together. We are not asking anyone to find our beginning romantic. We are asking you to understand that beginnings do not define what things become. She stared at that sentence for a moment after she wrote it. Luca didn't tell her to cut it. They sent it. Then she called her father. That conversation lasted 12 minutes and was the hardest thing she'd done in the entire 3 weeks of the arrangement. Harder than the dinner with Isabella. Harder than Marco Delacroix at the gala. Harder than sitting in that car watching the article spread. Her father's voice had the careful, controlled quality of a man trying not to ask the question he most needed answered, and she told him the truth. Not all of it, not the specific financial terms, but the structural truth. Yes, it had started as a business decision, and no, she wasn't in danger, and yes, she was okay, and she needed him to trust her. There was a silence on the line. Then her father said, "Did you do it for the company?" Not a question, a recognition. "Partly," she said. Another silence. Selena rose. His voice broke slightly on the second word and recovered. "You didn't have to." "I know," she said. "I made a choice. It's mine. Don't carry it." She hung up and sat for a moment in the bathroom, with the door closed and the lights on, and let herself feel the specific weight of that conversation for exactly 90 seconds. Then she washed her face with cold water and went back to the kitchen. Luca was on his third call. She made coffee. She did not think about her father's voice. By 4 in the morning, 3 things had happened. The original article had been followed by 6 more from competing outlets, all working from the same leaked information, all building the same narrative. Mafia Boss orchestrates fake marriage for corporate control, recruits desperate businesswoman with failing company. The framing was exactly as reductive and exactly as damaging as it was designed to be. She read 2 of them and stopped reading. Dominic had confirmed that Raphael's copies of the contract photograph had been surrendered and destroyed, which meant Raphael had not been the source of the leak to the press, which meant the press leak came from someone else entirely, someone with access to the same information through a different channel, and that someone was almost certainly operating on Delacroix's behalf, or was Delacroix himself, and Isabella Moretti had called. Luca took that call in the study with the door closed. She heard 11 minutes of muffled conversation, no specific words. When he came out, his face was arranged into its usual containment, but there was something different underneath it. Not distress exactly, something more complex. Something that looked, on the rare occasions when she caught it at angles he didn't intend to show her, like relief. "What did she say?" Selena asked. "She said she knew from the beginning." He sat down across from her. "She said she's been waiting to see what it became." Selena looked at him. "And what did you tell her it became?" He held her gaze for a moment. "I told her the truth." She didn't ask what the truth was. She understood that the answer to that question existed in a register neither of them had fully mapped yet, and that 4 in the morning after the worst night of the last 3 weeks was not the time to map it. "Get some sleep," she said. "You too." Neither of them slept much. The council emergency session was called for Friday at 2 in the afternoon, not the scheduled vote. That was still 12 days away. This was a special convening, demanded by Delacroix under the emergency provisions of the organizational charter, specifically the clause requiring immediate review of any matter that constituted a potential threat to organizational integrity. He'd filed the demand at 6 in the morning, citing the public disclosure of the marriage arrangement as grounds. Dominic briefed them at 9. 12 council members would be present. Delacroix had 3 votes confirmed. Luca had 4. The remaining 5 were variable, which in the specific mathematics of this situation meant everything. "Caruso," Luca said. "Still persuadable," Dominic said. "But Delacroix got to him last night. He's rattled." "What does Caruso want?" "Stability. He's been saying that consistently for 2 years. He doesn't want Marco. He doesn't want the disruption of a leadership change. He wants things to work." "Then I need to show him they work." Luca looked at Selena. "Both of us." She understood. "I'm coming to the meeting." Dominic looked between them. "That's unusual. Wives don't typically—" "She's not typical," Luca said. "Simple. Final." She spent the morning preparing the way she prepared for the most important pitches. Not by rehearsing speeches, but by building the complete picture in her head, understanding every angle, every likely challenge, every possible direction the conversation could go, and where she needed to be positioned when it did. She'd done it 100 times in conference rooms. She'd done it the night she walked into Moretti Tower in the rain with a marketing portfolio and 14 minutes on the clock. She could do it in front of 12 men who wanted to tear her marriage apart. She dressed carefully. Not the gala blue, not the navy suit. A charcoal dress, clean lines, nothing performative about it. The kind of thing a woman wore when she wanted to be taken seriously rather than noticed. She pulled her hair back. No jewelry except the ring, which she'd been wearing for 3 weeks and had stopped consciously registering until this morning when she looked at it in the mirror and registered it very consciously indeed. Luca appeared in the doorway of her room. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Ready?" he said. "No," she said honestly. Let's go. The Moretti Council met in a building on the Upper East Side that presented itself to the world as the offices of a private equity firm, which it partially was. The conference room was on the third floor. Dark wood, long table, 12 chairs, the kind of lighting that was expensive enough to seem natural, but was actually designed to flatten emotion and make everything feel procedural. Selena walked in beside Luca and felt all 11 pairs of eyes that were already present move to her simultaneously, and held herself still under the weight of it. Marco Delacroix was at the far end of the table. He looked exactly as he had at the gala. Silver-haired, agreeable-faced, warm in the specific way of something that was performing warmth over a completely different intention. He looked at her when she walked in with an expression of polite surprise, as if her presence was unexpected and mildly interesting rather than the direct challenge to his strategy that it was. "Mrs. Moretti," he said, "this is unusual." "So is calling an emergency session based on a press leak," she said pleasantly, and sat down. Something shifted in the room, small but real. Caruso was 3 seats to her left. She'd memorized the seating from Dominic's briefing. 64 years old, heavy-set, with the face of someone who had been losing sleep for a while. He was looking at the table. Delacroix opened the session himself, which told her he'd already established enough procedural control to do so. He laid out the matter with the smooth efficiency of someone who had been preparing this presentation for considerably longer than one night. The contract marriage, the financial arrangement, the deception perpetrated against the council, and the organizational charter, which required leadership to maintain the integrity and authenticity necessary to represent the organization's interests. He spoke for 9 minutes without interruption. Then Luca said, "Are you finished?" Delacroix looked at him. "I have additional, Are you finished with the part you prepared?" Luca said, "because I'd like to respond before you introduce whatever comes next." A beat. Delacroix gestured with one hand. "Proceed." Luca did not have prepared remarks. She knew that, had watched him not prepare them this morning, had understood that this was a deliberate choice, that prepared remarks in this specific room would be read as defensive, as the performance of a man justifying himself, and that was not what this moment required. What he said instead was quieter and considerably more direct than anything she'd heard him say in the 3 weeks she'd known him, and she sat beside him and listened to a man she'd married for a contract tell 12 people the truth about how he'd come to mean it. He didn't apologize for the arrangement. He didn't reframe it as something it hadn't been. He said plainly, yes, the marriage began as a strategic decision made under pressure, and yes, the pressure was real, and yes, Selena had entered it with her own motivations that were equally practical, and none of that was what he was asking the council to evaluate. "What I'm asking you to evaluate," he said, "is what's actually in front of you today, which is a marriage that began one way and became another. I'm not asking you to take my word for that. I'm asking you to look at it." Delacroix said, The charter requires authentic commitment to organizational interests," Luca said. "It does not require that commitment to have existed from the first day. It requires that it exists now." He paused. "Does it, Marco? Does it exist? Look at this room and tell me what you actually see." The silence was different from any silence she'd experienced in the last 3 weeks. It had a texture to it, the specific density of people reevaluating in real time. Then Delacroix said, "I see a man who made a fraudulent arrangement and is asking us to excuse it because he's decided he has feelings." And Selena said, "No." Every head turned to her. She hadn't planned to speak yet. It wasn't the planned moment, but something in the word fraudulent, said with that specific dismissive precision, aimed at reducing 3 weeks of the most difficult and transformative experience of her life into a legal technicality, reached past her composure and landed somewhere that had nothing to do with strategy. "No," she said again, steadier. "You're framing this as a deception against this council, and I understand why that framing is useful to you. But I was there. I was at that table. I signed that contract with full knowledge of what I was doing and why. And I'm sitting in this room 3 weeks later, and I'm telling you that what I know now is not what I knew then." She looked at Delacroix directly. "I'm not asking you to find that convenient. I'm asking you to find it true. Those are different requests." The room was very still. Caruso looked up from the table. He was looking at her, not at Luca, not at Delacroix, at her, with the expression of someone who is trying to determine whether something is real. She held his gaze. The organization's interests, she said more quietly, are not served by a leadership challenge built on a press leak that you orchestrated through a disgruntled family member you've been cultivating for 14 months. She watched Delacroix's face and saw the precise moment the calculation shifted in his eyes, the moment he understood that she knew. I'm not a lawyer and I'm not a council member, but I understand leverage. And what I understand right now is that the documentation of that 14-month relationship exists and is in this building, and that changes what this meeting is about considerably. She stopped. The silence was absolute. Luca beside her was perfectly still. She felt him rather than saw him. The quality of his stillness, the specific controlled tension of someone watching something unfold that they hadn't scripted and were choosing to let run. Delacroix said nothing for 4 seconds. Then he said, "I don't know what you think you have." "Then let's find out together," she said. What happened in the next 40 minutes was not a clean victory. Nothing in rooms like that was ever clean. It was a negotiation conducted under extreme pressure with incomplete information on both sides, and it moved in increments so small they were almost invisible. A question answered differently, a posture shifted, a vote recalculated in someone's head in real time. Caruso spoke twice. Both times he directed his comments to Luca, and both times they were the comments of a man who was looking for a reason to land on a particular side and was in the process of finding it. 2 of Delacroix's confirmed votes held. 1 didn't. At the end of it, the emergency session was closed without a formal challenge being filed. Not a victory, a deferral, a pause, a tactical withdrawal by Delacroix that was not the same as a concession, but was, for the next 12 days until the scheduled vote, effectively the same thing. They walked out of the building into the October afternoon, and she breathed the cold air and felt her legs register, for the first time since she'd walked in, that they'd been carrying her weight for 3 hours on approximately 2 hours of sleep. Luca's car was at the curb. They got in. Neither of them spoke for 2 blocks. Then he said, "You told them about Delacroix and Raphael." "Yes. I know it wasn't the plan." She turned to look at him. It was the right move. He looked at her for a moment. Something in his face that she was still learning to read. The specific expression of a man recalibrating who someone is. "Yes," he said. "It was." 3 blocks of silence. "You said something in there," he said, "about what you know now not being what you knew then." She watched the city. "I said a lot of things in there." "That specific thing." She was quiet for a moment. "I meant it," she said. He didn't respond immediately. She felt him sitting with it. The weight of 2 words, the specific weight they carried in the context of everything that had brought them to a car on the Upper East Side on a Friday afternoon. "Selena." She looked at him. He looked back at her, and for the first time in 3 weeks, she saw something in his face that wasn't organized or controlled or arranged into composure. Something that was just there, present and undefended, looking at her from behind everything he'd spent his entire life building to keep the world at exactly the right distance. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. She understood. The next 8 days were a different kind of war. Delacroix didn't stop. She'd never thought he would, had understood from the moment the emergency session closed that the pause was tactical, not terminal. He worked the remaining persuadable votes through channels she and Dominic tracked in real time. Dinners she wasn't invited to, phone calls intercepted through methods she chose not to ask about, careful, quiet pressure applied to men who were tired and uncertain and looking for the easiest path through a complicated situation. She worked the same channels differently, not through threats or leverage, through presence. She called on 2 council members' wives for coffee, once each, and had genuine conversations about things that had nothing to do with organizational politics, and understood that in the specific world she was now operating in, those conversations were also entirely about organizational politics. She attended a dinner with Caruso and his wife at a restaurant in the West Village and spent 3 hours being exactly what she actually was: direct, practical, willing to admit uncertainty, not performing anything, and watched Caruso's wife warm to her and understood that Caruso would notice. She worked 18-hour days. The Moretti hospitality campaign was in full development, and she pushed it hard because it was real. And because real work was the thing keeping her sane, and because every deliverable that landed was evidence of something she couldn't manufacture. She and Luca moved around each other in the penthouse with an altered quality. Not the careful choreography of the first 2 weeks, not the professional distance of two people executing a contract. Something that had less architecture to it. Something that left more room for the accidental, genuine moments. The kitchen at midnight. The conversation that started as a briefing and became something else. The morning she found him already awake at 5:30, sitting at the window with coffee, and just sat down beside him without asking why. And they watched the city get light together without either of them saying a word. She did not analyze it. She was afraid of what analysis would find. The night before the council vote, Dominic's final count had them at 6 votes to Delacroix's 5, with one genuinely undecided. Caruso. 6 votes was a majority. 6 votes was enough, if nothing moved overnight. She was in the kitchen at 10 when Luca appeared and said, "Raphael is requesting to speak to the council tomorrow." She turned from the counter. "In what capacity?" "Formally, he's requested permission to make a statement." "About what?" "About what he did. About Delacroix. About 14 months of cooperation with a faction working against family leadership." Luca's voice was careful in a specific way. "He wants to recant." She sat with that for a moment. "Is it real?" she said. "I don't know." "Does it matter? If it's in front of the council, it could move Caruso," Luca said. "Or it could look like coercion, like I forced him to recant through threats, and I'm using him as a prop." He looked at her. "It's a risk." "Everything tomorrow is a risk." "Yes." She looked at him across the kitchen. He was wearing what she'd come to think of as his late-night clothes. Dark trousers, a shirt not yet pressed, the version of him that existed after the day's performance was finished and before the next day started. The version that was, she'd come to understand, considerably more real than anything that appeared in council rooms or at charity galas. "What do you want to do?" she said. "I want to ask you what you think." She held his gaze. That sentence, in his voice, with that specific quality of meaning, she stored it somewhere. Stored it in the category of things she was collecting without knowing yet what she was going to do with them. "Let him speak," she said. "Real or not, the statement itself becomes part of the record. And if Caruso is the kind of man I think he is, he'll hear the difference between performance and truth. And if he can't, then we lose by 1 vote and we fight it another way." She paused. "We don't start hedging tonight. We go in tomorrow with everything we have and we hold our position." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he crossed the kitchen. He stopped in front of her, closer than the careful professional distance of the last 3 weeks, and looked at her from that distance, and she looked back at him, and the thing she'd been not naming was very present in the room with them, filling the space between their bodies with a specific pressure that had been building for days, and that she had been careful, very careful, not to acknowledge in any way that made it real. "Selena," he said, very quiet. Her name in his voice at that specific volume did something to her that she was not going to examine right now. "Don't," she said. "Not tonight. Not before tomorrow." "Why?" "Because if something happens tomorrow, if it goes wrong, I don't want the last thing between us to be something we said when we were exhausted and terrified and running on no sleep." She held his gaze. "Say it after. When we know." He stood there for a moment. "Okay," he said. He stepped back. The distance returned. The pressure didn't entirely dissipate, but it arranged itself into something manageable, something she could carry through the night and into tomorrow. She went to her room. She did not sleep. The council vote was called for 10 in the morning. They arrived together, always together now. Not the staged togetherness of the first week, but the actual kind, the kind that came from having been through something. She wore the navy suit. She'd thought about it and chosen it deliberately. The same suit she'd worn to their first meeting, the same suit she'd signed the contract in. Not a coincidence. A statement. A line drawn from that first room to this one. 11 of the 12 council members were already seated when they walked in. The 12th, Caruso, arrived 3 minutes later, which was 3 minutes of the most pressurized silence she'd experienced yet. 12 people in a room with something enormous and unresolved between them, waiting for the specific person whose decision would determine the shape of everything that came next. Caruso sat down. He didn't look at Delacroix. He didn't look at Luca. He looked at her. And in that look, she read something she recognized. The expression of a man who has been awake all night, making a decision that was never going to be comfortable, and has finally made it and is at peace with the discomfort. Raphael was brought in before the vote. He stood at the end of the table and spoke for 6 minutes. And what he said was not polished and not performed. It was the statement of a man who had been carrying something for 3 years and had put it down. And whatever the mixture of motivations behind it, the fact of the putting down was real. She could hear it. She thought Caruso could too. Delacroix said, when Raphael finished, "This is coerced testimony." "It isn't," Raphael said, quietly, looking at Luca. "It isn't." The vote was called. She sat beside Luca and felt the absolute stillness of him. The complete composure of a man who had run every calculation, made every move available to him, and arrived at the moment where the calculation was over and the only thing left was the result. She found his hand under the table. She didn't think about it. Her hand just moved to his, found it, and held it. His fingers closed around hers. The vote was called member by member in order of seniority. When it reached Caruso, the room stopped breathing. Caruso looked at the table for 1 second. Then he said, "I vote to affirm current leadership." 6-5. The challenge failed. The room moved. Not eruption, this wasn't that kind of room, but the controlled release of a pressure that had been building for days. People shifting in their chairs, the quality of the air changing, Delacroix's face doing something careful and controlled that didn't conceal what was underneath it. Luca's hand tightened on hers. She looked at him. He was looking back at her, and the composure was still there, still in place. But the eyes, those January gray eyes that she'd been learning to read for 3 weeks, were doing something she hadn't seen in them before. Something that had nothing to do with strategy or control or the management of a dangerous world. Something that was just him. Just the two of them in a room full of people, holding on. And then Delacroix stood up and said, in a voice that had lost all its warmth and all its performance and was just cold machinery underneath, "This isn't finished." He walked out. 3 of his allies followed. The remaining council members began the procedural work of closing the session, and Dominic appeared at the door, and the room began to decompress into the ordinary business of aftermath. And underneath all of it, underneath the relief and the exhaustion and the work that still remained, something had shifted in a way that couldn't be unshifted. She became aware slowly that she was still holding his hand. She didn't let go. Neither did he. Outside the building in the cold October afternoon, Dominic was already on his phone coordinating the response to Delacroix's next moves. Because there would be next moves. There were always next moves. This world did not stop for victories any more than it stopped for anything else. Security was tightened. Protocols were reviewed. The machinery of the Moretti organization absorbed the result and kept moving. And then Dominic stopped. His face changed. He lowered the phone slowly and looked at Luca with an expression she'd never seen on him before. Not the operational calm of a man managing a crisis, but something else. The expression of someone who has just received information they don't want to deliver. "What?" Luca said. Dominic said, "There's been a development. Delacroix?" He paused, glanced at Selena. "He's made a move we didn't anticipate." "Tell me." "He's filed a federal disclosure with the Organized Crime Task Force. Full organizational intelligence, 14 months of it." Dominic's voice was very controlled. "Raphael's cooperation, the council structure, He stopped. "Everything," Luca said. "Everything." The word landed in the October afternoon like something dropped from a great height. Selena felt the ground shift under her feet for the second time in 3 weeks. And this time it was different from the car, different from the restaurant, different from every other moment the ground had moved beneath this arrangement. This was not a council vote. This was not a press leak. This was not something that could be managed through intelligence operations and careful positioning. This was federal. This was the kind of thing that didn't stay contained. She looked at Luca. He was looking at Dominic with that absolute stillness, and she could see him processing it, the full scope of it, the implications running through him in real time, the specific calculation of a man who has just understood that the war he thought he'd won was the battle before the actual war. He turned to look at her, and in his eyes, those January gray eyes that she'd been reading for 3 weeks, that she'd learned to see through to the person underneath the composure, She saw something she hadn't seen in him before. Not fear, the thing that lives just past fear. The moment when a person understands that what they're about to face is going to require everything they have, and they look at the person beside them to see if that person is still there. She held his gaze. She didn't move. She was still there. The next 72 hours were the kind that leave marks. Not the visible kind. Not bruises or cuts or anything a person could point to and say, "Here, this is where it happened." The kind that settle into the architecture of who you are and stay there, permanent and quiet, changing the way you hold yourself when you walk into rooms for the rest of your life. Selena learned this about herself in the back of a car on the Upper East Side on a Friday afternoon, sitting beside a man who was about to face something that could not be managed through intelligence or positioning or the careful deployment of leverage. She learned it in the specific moment when she looked at him, and he looked at her, and neither of them moved, and she understood that stillness, in that moment, was the only honest thing available. She was still there. That was the whole of it. Dominic spent the first hour on the phone in the front seat while the car moved through traffic that didn't care about any of it. The cabs and the delivery trucks and the people crossing at lights with their heads down against the cold. All of them completely indifferent to the fact that the man in the back seat was in the process of having his entire world pulled out from under him by someone he'd underestimated. That was the part that cost Luca the most. She could see it, not the federal disclosure itself. He'd lived in proximity to that specific risk for 3 years and had structured his operations accordingly, had layers of legal protection and documented separation between the legitimate enterprises and everything else. It was the underestimation. The fact that he'd read Delacroix as a political operator and not a man willing to burn everything down, including himself, rather than lose. Those were different kinds of people, and he'd miscategorized. And in his world, miscategorization had consequences. She watched him process it without performing the processing. No anger, no visible recalibration, just the absolute internal stillness of someone absorbing a blow and deciding in real time what it meant. "How bad?" she said when Dominic got off the phone. Dominic turned from the front seat. He looked at her first, then at Luca. The disclosure is comprehensive. 14 months of organizational intelligence, council structure, operational protocols, key relationships, financial routing. He paused. Raphael was thorough. Raphael didn't know all of that, Luca said. No, but Delacroix supplemented. He's been building his own intelligence file for longer than 14 months. Raphael was one source. Dominic's voice was flat and careful. The task force has been aware of certain Moretti operational interests for approximately 8 months. The disclosure accelerated their timeline. They'll move within 30 days. 30 days. The number landed with a specific weight given its history in this story. The legitimate holdings, Selena said, the hotels, the real estate, the equity portfolios, are they documented as genuinely separate? Dominic looked at her. They are. Then they're insulated. Legally, yes. The optics are manageable, she said. Optics are always manageable if the legal structure is clean. She looked at Luca. Is it clean? Yes, he said. Then the business survives. The hotels survive. She held his gaze. Vaughn Creative's contract is with the hospitality division. If that division is legally clean, the contract holds. She said it not because she was thinking about her own situation. She had, somewhere in the last 3 weeks, stopped thinking about the contract in the terms she'd originally thought about it, but because she needed him to understand that the thing she was choosing to stay for was not contingent on the financial outcome. She needed that on the table clearly before anything else happened. He understood. She saw him understand. Okay, he said, here's what we do. What they did was not simple and was not fast and required a particular quality of nerve that she hadn't known she possessed until she found herself possessing it in a series of rooms over the following 3 days that she would never fully describe to anyone afterward. The attorney arrived at the penthouse at 7 that evening. Not Luca's regular counsel, but a specialist, a woman named Hartley, who had the lean, focused quality of someone who had spent 20 years doing exactly one kind of work and had become very good at it. She sat at the dining table with 3 associates and spent 4 hours going through the organizational documentation that Dominic produced, building the legal architecture of a defense that was not, she said, as straightforwardly complicated as Delacroix had probably hoped. The disclosure is comprehensive, Hartley said, at 11, but comprehensive isn't the same as actionable. The separation between the legitimate holdings and the operational interests is documented and consistent. If the task force moves, they move on the operational layer. The business empire, she used the word without discomfort, which Selina respected, is defensible. And personally, Luca said, Hartley looked at him steadily. That depends on what they find when they look, which depends on what's actually there. A pause. I need complete transparency from you, not organizational transparency. Personal. Luca was quiet for a moment. Then he talked for 40 minutes. Selina stayed in the room. He didn't ask her to leave. She didn't offer to go. She sat at the far end of the table with a glass of water that she didn't drink and listened to her husband, her actual husband, the word had stopped tripping her by now, tell a lawyer the true shape of 3 years of his life, and she did not flinch at any of it, and she did not look away. And when it was over and Hartley was making notes in the silence, she looked at him across the table, and he looked back at her, and something passed between them that was past language. She had heard all of it. She was still there. Hartley left at 1 in the morning with her associates and 300 pages of documentation. The apartment was quiet. Dominic had gone to coordinate the security review. The staff had long since retired. She and Luca were alone in the kitchen again. The place they kept ending up, she'd noticed. This specific room, this specific quiet, at this specific hour of the night, when the day's performance was over, and whatever was real between them had room to exist. He was standing at the window. She was at the table. Neither of them had spoken since Hartley left. Say it now, she said. He turned from the window. She held his gaze. You said after, when we know. She paused. We know. He crossed the room. He stopped in front of her. The same distance as that night before the vote. The same specific proximity that had been carefully maintained and was now not being maintained. And she could feel the weight of everything they'd been through in the last 3 weeks in the air between them. All of it. The conference room, and the rain, and the contract, and the family dinner, and the gala, and the car, and the council chamber, and this kitchen at 1 in the morning. He said, I don't know how to do this. She blinked. Of all the things she'd expected him to say, that specific sentence said in that specific voice, not the controlled voice, not the operational voice, just his voice, stripped of every layer of management, was not one of them. Do what? She said. This. He gestured between them, a small frustrated movement completely at odds with his usual stillness. Whatever this is, I know how to run an organization. I know how to manage threats and read rooms and hold positions under pressure. He looked at her directly. I don't know how to do what I'm doing right now, which is standing in my kitchen at 1 in the morning, wanting to tell you something I've never told anyone, and not knowing if it's real because I've never had a reference point for what real is supposed to feel like. She was quiet for a moment. What do you want to tell me? She said. He held her gaze. That I'm glad it was you. She breathed. Not strategically, he said. Not because of how you handled the council or what you did at the gala or any of the 100 things you've done in the last 3 weeks that I couldn't have predicted and couldn't have managed without. He paused. Just you. I'm glad it was you. She stood up. She was standing close enough to him now that she could see the specific quality of his eyes in the kitchen light. Not the January ocean she'd first described them to herself as, but something warmer than that. Something that had been warming by degrees over 3 weeks, and was now, at 1 in the morning after the worst and most clarifying days of her adult life, something she didn't have a cold metaphor for anymore. I signed that contract, she said, because I was desperate and practical and out of options. I want you to know I know that. I'm not going to rewrite it into something more flattering. She held his gaze. But I've been practical my entire life, and I've been in a lot of rooms with a lot of people, and I have never once in any of those rooms felt like I was... She stopped. Found it. Like I was fully seen. Like the actual version of me, the one that exists when I'm not performing competence for someone else's comfort, was actually visible to another person. She paused. You see me, she said. I don't know when that started. But you do. He reached up and put his hand against her face. Not a performance. Not the practiced gesture of a man executing a role, just a hand. his hand, warm against her cheek, and she turned her face into it slightly in the way of something that has been cold for a long time recognizing warmth. He kissed her. Not the first time they'd kissed. There had been public moments, performed moments, the careful execution of a marriage that needed to look real. This was not any of those things. This was the kind of kiss that happens when two people have run out of performances and are standing in the wreckage of everything they built and finding each other in it. And it was quiet and not dramatic and more real than anything that had happened between them in 30 days of increasingly real things. When they separated, she kept her eyes closed for a moment. Then she opened them and looked at him. "The contract ends in 9 months," she said. "I know. I'm not renewing a contract." "I know," he said again. Something in his voice. "I'm not asking you to renew a contract." She understood what he was asking instead. She thought about it for exactly as long as it deserved, which was not very long because she'd been thinking about it for weeks without admitting she was thinking about it, and by now the answer had the quality of something that had always been there waiting for her to stop being afraid of it. "Ask me properly," she said. The corner of his mouth did the thing. Not a smile, the shadow of a smile. The specific expression she'd first seen in a conference room 30 days ago and had been collecting ever since. "Selena Vaughn." "Moretti," she said. "Selena Moretti." He held her gaze. "Stay." She stayed. The 30 days after that were not easy. Nothing that followed was easy, and she would have been suspicious of it if it had been, because she'd lived long enough to know that things that came easily were either not real or not worth having. The federal investigation moved on its own timeline, indifferent to the personal resolutions happening in penthouse kitchens. Hartley and her team spent 6 weeks building the legal separation between the legitimate empire and the operational layer that the task force was actually pursuing. And the work was painstaking and expensive and required Luca to make decisions about certain organizational relationships that cost him something she could see, but that he made without hesitation. He was dismantling, carefully and legally, the parts of the structure that couldn't survive scrutiny. Not because he was forced to, the legal insulation would have held, Hartley was confident, but because he chose to. She watched him do it. She watched him sit across from Hartley in the dining room that had become a war room and systematically close doors he'd kept open for 3 years. And she understood that he was not doing it for the investigation. He was doing it because something had shifted in what he wanted the next decade of his life to look like. And the shift had her shape in it. She didn't say anything about it. She just watched and understood and was present. Delacroix was a different kind of problem. The federal disclosure had been his nuclear option. The move you make when you've decided you're willing to burn the field rather than lose it. And in deploying it, he had exposed himself as thoroughly as he'd exposed Luca. The council, including the members who had voted with him, recognized what it was. A man willing to cooperate with federal authorities against the organization he purported to represent was not a man anyone in that room could afford to trust, regardless of their feelings about leadership. He resigned from the council 11 days after the disclosure. She wasn't present for that meeting, but Dominic gave her the account afterward. And what struck her was not the resignation itself, but the specific detail that Delacroix, walking out, had looked across the table at the empty seat where his 3 allies had been sitting before they distanced themselves and said nothing, just looked at it, and walked out. She thought about that look for a while. The look of a man who had built something over 14 months and watched it come apart in 11 days. She didn't feel satisfaction about it, which surprised her slightly. She felt something more complicated. The specific recognition of a person who understood what it cost to be that wrong about something you'd invested everything in. She didn't share that thought with anyone. Raphael left New York. He called Luca the night before he went. She was in the other room, heard Luca's side of it, which was brief and in Italian, and ended with a silence that lasted long enough that she looked up from her laptop. When Luca came back into the room, she didn't ask. He sat down beside her and was quiet for a moment. He said he was sorry, Luca said. Do you believe him? A pause. Yes. Another pause. I don't know if it matters. It might, she said. Not now, later. He looked at her. People are capable of more than their worst decisions, she said. I'd like to believe that. Given the number of questionable decisions I've made in the last 2 months, something moved in his face. Your decisions weren't, they were exactly what they were, she said. desperate and practical and partly mercenary, and also the best thing I've ever done. Those things can all be true at the same time. She looked at him steadily. Same goes for other people. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he picked up his phone and sent a message she didn't see. She thought it might have been to Raphael. She didn't ask. She called her father on a Sunday in November, 3 weeks after the council vote and 10 days after Delacroix's resignation, and had the conversation she hadn't been able to have before. All of it. The financial terms, the original contract, the calculation she'd made and why she'd made it and what she'd told herself and what had actually happened. Her father listened the way he always listened, which was completely none of the half-attention or constructed responses she'd experienced with other people. Just the total focused presence of a man giving something his full care. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Does he know what he has?" She thought about that. "He's learning," she said. "Good," her father said. "Make sure he keeps learning." She laughed. It came out slightly surprised, the way laughing sometimes did when it arrived from somewhere real. "I will, Dad." "The money," he said more carefully. "Selena, we're not taking the contract payment," she said. "We're renegotiating the terms, all of it." Silence. "The company will be fine," she said. "We have the hospitality contract, which is real work, which we earned. That's enough." She paused. "That was always enough. I just couldn't see it from where I was standing." Her father said, after a moment, "Your mother would have liked him, based on what you've told me." A pause. "She liked difficult men, as long as they were honest about it." She closed her eyes briefly. "He is," she said. "Honest about it." The Vaughn creative campaign for Moretti Hotels launched in December, and was, by any measure she knew how to apply, very good work. She was proud of it in the specific way she was proud of things that came from genuine effort rather than performance. The hotel rebranding ran across digital and print and out of home, clean and honest in its aesthetic, selling luxury through texture and light rather than aspiration and exclusion. The direct booking numbers in the first 3 weeks beat her projections by 6%. She told Luca at dinner, and he looked at the numbers and looked at her and said, "I knew they would." "You couldn't have known that." "I knew the work was good. Simple, like a fact about the weather." She shook her head, but she was smiling. Dana came to dinner at the penthouse in early December. It was the first time she'd been, and she arrived with the specific quality of a person who had been holding a large number of questions in reserve for months, and was now in the environment where those questions were finally permitted. She lasted 45 minutes before she said, across the dinner table to Luca, "Are you actually good for her, or is this something I need to worry about?" Selena said, "Dana." "No, I'm asking," Dana said. "I've been watching her hold up a collapsing company and take care of everyone else for 3 years, and I want to know if there is one person in her life who is actually watching out for her instead of the other way around." The table was quiet. Luca looked at Dana for a moment with the careful assessment she recognized from every room he'd ever walked into, and then he said, "Yes." Dana looked at him. "Yes," he said again. "I'm watching out for her." Dana looked at Selena. Selena looked back at her with an expression that said, "I know, I know." Dana picked up her wine glass. "Okay," she said. "Good." The second wedding was Valentina's idea. She arrived at the penthouse in the second week of December with a look on her face that Selena had come to recognize as the expression of someone who has already decided something and is delivering it as a suggestion purely as a courtesy. "You had a legal ceremony in an attorney's office," Valentina said. "That doesn't count." "It's legally binding," Selena said. "I said it doesn't count. I didn't say it wasn't legal." Valentina sat down at the kitchen table. "The family should be there. The real family. Not a signing." Selena looked at her. "Isabella wants it," Valentina said. "She hasn't asked for anything. She's just waiting." Selena thought about Isabella in the sitting room at the family townhouse, those dark eyes moving over her face with systematic efficiency. About what she'd said, "I am not your enemy." About the specific quality of being seen by someone who didn't need to say everything they knew. "I'll talk to Luca," she said. She talked to Luca. He said, "I was going to suggest it." She said, "Valentina beat you to it." the corner of his mouth. She usually does. The ceremony was on a Saturday in January at the Moretti Estate in Connecticut, which she'd never visited before, and which turned out to be a house that had the specific quality of places that have been genuinely lived in across generations. Not immaculate, not staged, but layered with the accumulated weight of real life. Worn edges and good bones and rooms that smelled like wood and old books and the specific scent of a family that had existed here for a long time. It was small. Immediate family. Isabella in the front, Valentina beside her, Renata in attendance with the careful, composed neutrality of a woman who had not yet arrived at warmth, but had stopped arriving at hostility, which was progress, and she accepted it as such. Her father came up from Westchester. Dana stood beside her. Dominic stood beside Luca. There was no performance. That was the thing she noticed most, standing in that room with the January light coming through tall windows and the Connecticut cold pressing against the glass outside. There was nothing to perform. She'd spent 62 days performing something that had become real, and standing here now in what was supposed to be the real version. She felt the absence of the performance, like the absence of weight she'd been carrying so long, she'd forgotten it was there. She wore her own dress, not borrowed, not provided, not selected for strategic effect. A dress she'd bought for herself, pale and simple, the kind of thing her mother would have called elegant without trying, which was the highest compliment her mother gave to clothes. Luca wore a dark suit, no tie. The top button open. She looked at him across the room and thought about the first time she'd looked at him. 34th floor, rain against black glass, those gray eyes already on her before she'd finished walking in, and thought about the distance between that moment and this one, and found she couldn't fully measure it. It was the distance between who she'd been and who she was now, and she didn't have a unit for that. The vows were theirs, not written by anyone else, not borrowed from any text. Not the legal language of the attorney's office 2 months ago. Luca went first. He looked at her and said, I spent 34 years believing that control was the same as safety, that if I managed everything precisely enough, nothing could reach the part of me that could be hurt. He paused. You reached it. I didn't manage it. I don't think I wanted to. Another pause, shorter. I'm going to spend the rest of my life being grateful that you were desperate enough to say yes to something that should have frightened you more than it did. She heard Dana make a small sound that she was going to identify as a cough, and would never actually believe was a cough. She said, I came to your building in the rain with a failing company and 14 minutes on the clock, and I thought I was there to save something. She held his gaze. I was. I just didn't know what. She breathed. You're the most difficult person I've ever met and the most honest, which turns out to be related. And you see me in a way that I didn't know I needed to be seen. And I'm keeping you. That's it. That's the whole vow. I'm keeping you. Isabella, in the front row, said nothing. But she was looking at Selena with those dark eyes, and what was in them was not the assessing quality of the first dinner, the systematic evaluation of a woman looking for weakness. What was in them was something older and quieter and more absolute. It looked like recognition. It looked like the expression of a woman who had watched men in this family make decisions about power and love and survival for 60 years, and had seen the difference between the ones who understood what mattered and the ones who didn't, and had just added a name to the right list. Selena met her eyes for a moment. Isabella inclined her head, very slightly, the smallest possible gesture. It was enough. They signed the new certificate. Not a contract, not a legal arrangement with financial terms and dissolution clauses, just two names beside each other on a document that said they had chosen this in front of people who mattered to them. Her father shook Luca's hand afterward with the careful grip of a man delivering something important through the contact. Luca looked at him and said, She told me about your firm, what you built. A pause. I understand what building something costs. Her father looked at him for a moment. Take care of her, he said. Not instead of her, with her. She doesn't need protection. She needs a partner. I know, Luca said. Her father nodded, let go of his hand, found Selena across the room and looked at her with the look she'd been seeing on his face her whole life. Pride and worry and love in the specific combination that only existed in parents, and underneath all of it, relief. The particular relief of a person who has been carrying something heavy and has finally been allowed to set it down. She crossed the room and hugged him, and he held on longer than he usually did, And she let him because she understood what the holding on was about, and it was about more than today. The months that followed had their difficulties. The federal investigation moved slowly and landed where Hartley had predicted, on the operational layer, not the legitimate holdings. There were legal proceedings and negotiations, and a period of organizational restructuring that was expensive and complicated, and required Luca to make decisions that the version of him she'd met 2 months ago might not have made. He made them anyway. She watched him do it and said little because the decisions were his, and the work was his, and what he needed from her during it was not advice or management, but the simple continuous fact of her presence. She was present. Vaughn Creative had its best quarter in 4 years. She hired 3 people, including a junior strategist who reminded her of herself at 24, slightly too confident, working twice as hard as necessary to compensate for not feeling like she belonged, and spent considerable energy on that specific hire because she understood the profile from the inside. Dana said in March, "You're different." They were in the Vaughn Creative office, end of day, the good tired of a long, productive week settling over both of them. "How?" Selena said. "Like you stopped waiting," Dana said. "You've been waiting since I met you, waiting to feel secure enough, waiting to feel stable enough, waiting for the thing that was going to make it okay to stop holding everything so tight." She looked at her. "You stopped?" Selena thought about that. "I stopped," she confirmed. It was a Tuesday evening in April when she understood the full shape of what her life had become. She was at the kitchen table with her laptop, the Moretti campaign analytics open, the spring city visible through the windows. Warmer now, the bare trees in the park below finally showing green, the light different from the hard winter light she'd arrived into. Luca was in the study on a call, his voice a low, continuous murmur she could hear but not decipher. The apartment was quiet, in the way it was quiet now. Not the weighted silence of 2 people maintaining careful professional distance, but the easy quiet of a shared space. A life that had arranged itself around 2 people who had stopped performing and started just living. She was looking at the analytics and also not looking at the analytics. She was looking at her own hands on the keyboard. The ring on her left hand, which she'd stopped consciously registering at some point, and had started just wearing the way you wore things that belonged to you. She thought about rain on black glass and 14 minutes on a clock and a marketing portfolio held in both hands like something that could save her. It hadn't saved her. Not the way she'd thought. The contract hadn't saved her. The money hadn't saved her. The practical calculation she'd made with what she thought was full information about her own desperation and its limits. What had saved her, she thought, was something considerably less mappable and considerably less controllable than a contract. It was 62 days of being in a difficult room with a difficult person and finding out, incrementally and without planning to, that the person you became under pressure was someone you could actually stand to be. That was the thing that happened, really. That was what the contract had been, underneath its financial terms and its strategic architecture and all the careful management of 2 people trying to survive their separate, desperate situations. A room where she found out who she was. Luca appeared in the kitchen doorway. Call finished. He looked at her across the room with those gray eyes, warmer now than the January ocean she'd first mapped them as, and she looked back at him. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "Come here." He crossed the kitchen and stood beside her and looked at the analytics on her screen. "The April numbers. They're good." "I see that." He was looking at the screen, but she could feel him looking at her. "You're not looking at the screen." "I'm thinking." "About." She looked up at him. "About how I walked into your building 2 months ago thinking I was going to pitch a marketing contract and ended up completely changing my life." He was quiet for a moment. "Is that what happened?" "That's what happened." She held his gaze. "I'm not complaining about it." He sat down beside her, not at a professional distance, just beside her, in the ordinary way of people who had stopped calculating how close to sit. "The investigation," he said. "Hartley called this afternoon. The proceedings are moving toward resolution. The legitimate holdings—" "I know," she said. "She called me too." He looked at her. "She called you. You listed me as a secondary contact 3 weeks ago. Did you forget?" Something moved through his face. "No," he said. "I didn't forget." She understood that he'd done it deliberately and had been waiting to see if she'd noticed and whether she'd say anything about it. and that the fact that he'd done it at all was a specific kind of statement that Luca Moretti would never deliver directly, but was entirely capable of delivering through logistics. Good, she said. Outside, the April city was settling into evening, the specific gold of a spring sunset over Manhattan, the park going dark from the ground up, the buildings catching light and holding it for the last few minutes before it went. She watched it from the kitchen window and felt the strange, complete fullness of a moment that didn't need anything added to it. She had not saved her family with a contract. She had not solved her company's problems through a strategic arrangement. She had not walked into a glass tower on a rainy October night and come out with her life neatly resolved and her accounts balanced and her future secured through the careful execution of a plan. What had actually happened was messier than that, and more expensive, and required her to be wrong about several things she'd been certain about for years, and nearly destroyed both of them in the process. What had actually happened was real. She reached over without looking away from the window and put her hand on his where it rested on the table. His fingers closed around hers. The same way they had in the council chamber, the same instinctive closing, the same weight of it. She looked at the city going dark and thought, this is what it is. Not safe. She understood now, definitively, that safety had never been the real goal. It had been the thing she told herself she wanted, because the actual thing she wanted was harder to admit to. What she'd actually wanted, under all the practicality and the management and the careful, efficient performance of competence, was this: a hand that held on, a room that was hers, a life that had stopped being only about survival and had become about something that required no justification beyond its own existence. Not simple, but real. And sitting in Luca Moretti's kitchen on a Tuesday evening in April with the city turning gold outside the window and her hand in his and 62 days of impossible things behind them and whatever came next still ahead, she understood that real was the only thing she'd ever actually wanted. She just hadn't known, standing in the rain outside a glass tower with a marketing portfolio and 14 minutes on the clock, that this was where real was waiting. She knew now. That was enough. That was everything.